Welcome, welcome.
Back
Yo,
again.
yo.
Long time fam.
Hashtag squirrel hello to everyone. Back again. So let's just, I guess, get right into it because
I guess so.
we got about 10 minutes to go. So let's just get right into it. All right. So we're here for the California Task Force, the fourth meeting. This is the second day of that meeting. And looks like we're going to have some interesting topics today. Racism in baking, tax and labor. We'll quickly go through the eyewitnesses, and then, if Mr. Chris Larson would like to elaborate on some of those witnesses or the um, topics, we can do that. So let's go over the first topic, racism in baking, tax and labor. We have Mersa Baradon, who's in the building. All right. Who else do we have? We have a William Briggs. All right. We have a Jacqueline Jones. All right. And we have a David Smith and a Lawrence Lucas. Now, I couldn't find any information on Lawrence Lucas or David Smith. Are you two familiar with either Lawrence Lucas or a David Smith?
No, not me. You are Kim, but not myself. This is Chris, by the way. And also, big welcome to everybody. I see some folks in the chat. Let's go up. So big shout out to everybody who's in the chat right now. Big shout out to YouTube live stream. I'm not familiar with Mr. Lucas or Mr. Smith, but I am looking forward to this particular panel, which starts at what time? 10:05 or so, right? This is the racism and banking tax panel. And first of two panels, right, that we'll get today. That first panel will start around 10, right? Then there'll be a break, and then we expect that around 1 o'clock the second panel will start, where I know we'll go the upcoming guests are, or who the next guests are, or the next witnesses are. But yeah, the racism in banking and taxing is interesting and important, because it's something that I think we talked a little bit about yesterday, and I think Kim, you actually brought some of that up too, right? Public comment. Some of your interactions with the banks and how the banks have been racist.
Yeah, I mean, I really just, put it all out there and call for them to subpoena these people, because I've been dealing with the banking system. They will not provide any data. So, hopefully the task force will be able to, help sort this all out.
All right, so let's go on to the next topic. So they're going to break at lunch, and then looks like the next panel is going to be on the wealth gap, and the first testimony is going to be from a Terrence Dean, PhD. So let's go look this brother's bio real quick. All right, and then we have a Thomas Kramer. All right. Then we have Kevon Ward. Right. Then we have a Paul Austin. Now, I believe this is the correct Paul Austin. There might be a different Paul Austin, but I believe this is the correct one. Could be another one, but yeah, it looks like this is the brother who's got their homes appraised by someone, and it was under appraised or something like that. So hopefully that is the correct Paul Austin. So
yeah, and I saw in some of the comments, since ETM Media YouTube channel allows for our viewers to comment and engage, that the appraiser industry should also be heavily investigated.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so any further comments?
Just real quick. So this is the second panel, right? This is the panel that's going to talk about the wealth gap, and this is important, right? Because the wealth gap and wealth, and let's just be clear what we're talking about when we're talking about wealth, about the value of what you own minus the value of what you owe, right? As a household, just expressed as a member. What's up, Amber? What's up, Marjorie? What's up, everybody in the chat? I see y'all. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking, and what we know about wealth is wealth is the biggest, best way to look at the impact of the past, present. And that's important for us because we make arguments for reparations that sound like, hey, the past, slavery, Jim Crow, impacts the present right now. And so that's an important piece of information that we use, wealth, and what the typical Black household who descends from U.S. slavery holds wealth versus what the typical non-Black household who descends from U.S. slavery wealth. So this is going to be a very panel, but it's also a very important part of our work. And these are arguments that we want to understand very, very well and be able to explain very simply, because we talk a lot about wealth, but we don't always talk about it. We talk a lot about wealth. And I'll say it again. It's because what we know is that wealth and the differences in wealth between different groups are really some of the best ways to say, hey, this is the act of the past on the present, and be able to actually measure it with like a number, right? Thomas Kramer is on that living panel, right? And he is someone who has come up with some reparations numbers, I believe. I think he's the guy who has a number higher than the numbers that we normally talk about. So I'm looking forward from him about how much is the reparations bill from him. But I'm also looking forward to, and I thought Mersa Barad, who having that panel, I thought she might be in the. She could actually probably go in the panel too, because a lot of her work, and if you're working with her work, she has all the color of money, and it's a history of Black capitalism and racism and you know, and in finance and in Black business, et cetera, from way back, right? From Reconstruction, before Reconstruction, really, until the 1970s, 1980s. And she breaks it down very, very well in her book. She talks, you know, how the Freedmen's Bank was a bank were robbed, and she goes through it. Very, very good detail, and then brings us to the, you know, of the 1920s and the Depression era capitalism that was going on, that through you know, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and what Black folks were doing to do Black business. Obviously, what the government response to that was, and the impacts of those things on wealth, right? So I think she could probably go on both, but this is going to be both of these panels are going to be really, really important. I'm really looking forward to both of them.
Yeah, brother, you said it just wonderful, right? I did see Mersa Baradaran before in an interview, and she's definitely powerful. It's going to be a great testimony. And you're absolutely right. She can go on both the racism in banking and the wealth gap easily. And I just want to say one thing before we actually start. I did have an interview when I was out of town on vacation with his brother, Lauren Reed, and I'm actually going to be posting it this weekend. And I just want to say to our people who descend from chattel slavery is that we have to stop blaming ourselves, right? Our ancestors got kidnapped. So everything that happens to us is not our fault. I mean, you don't blame the rape victim, right, for being raped. So I just want to put that out there for anybody who's saying that we need to just pick up ourselves up by our bootstraps. You know, we need to stop blaming ourselves for that. So if there's anything, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that point, brother. You said it wonderfully, and thank you for saying that. And it's important that you said that in the context of what we're going to talk about today, right? During this hearing, right? When there's going to be talk about the wealth gap, right? Because it's important that people say what you said and you said, but also have some ideas about like how to express that in wealth. So what you just said is not our fault. We've been picking ourselves up by bootstraps forever, but we people with and without straps, right? And we was the shoes that people used, right? We were the boots, right? So, but if you look at the wealth picture, and I know we have about a minute left or so before the meeting starts, so I'll try to make this quick. But one thing to just point out is that, let's take one example, right? They say, go to college, and we heard a lot about education, right? In the education segregation panel. Well, what we know right now, back in 2016, and with the recent numbers done in 2019 by the Federal Reserve, shows that Black folks who have college degrees have less wealth folks who didn't graduate from high school. So high school dropouts, white high school dropouts, more wealth than Black folks with college degrees. Okay, so it's not our fault. That's what that means, right? It's not right, and we can go on and on. I could say the same thing for Black folks who own businesses versus don't own businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know we're up at the hour. This is gonna be another long meeting. So thanks for everybody for hanging in there with us, and again, thanks for the media team for making this live stream.
All right, I guess we'll get ready to pull up the stream. And I'll just say, yesterday, Chris, you posted a stat in the chat, something about, people that come from middle-class origins, or Black people typically coming from middle-class origins, lose that middle-class status by the time they grow up. And I was just like, yeah, it's like hustling backwards. We doing worse than, what was promised to us in the civil rights era.
Yeah, right, Kim, you're right. That comes from the Brookings Institution, by the way. So there's a report by the Brookings Institution a few years ago, and what it said is that 70% kids born into the middle class, quote unquote middle class, will fall out of the middle class as adults.
Okay? All right. So well, I see some action on the screen, so hate to cut you off, but we are going to get this live stream started.
Johnson. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Belton, would you please call the roll and determine if we have a quorum? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will go in order and ask that the task force members indicate their presence. Chair Moore?
Here.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown?
Present.
Senator Stephen Bradford?
Here.
Dr. Cheryl Grill?
Present.
Lisa Holder? Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer?
Here.
Dr. Javon Scott Lewis?
Present.
John Tamaki? Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp?
Here.
Madam Chair, there are 9 members of the task force and 5 members are needed for quorum. There are 9 members present. A quorum has been reestablished this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. Members of the task force and members of the public, welcome to the 4th meeting of the historic California Reparations Task Force. The task force scopes and powers are predicated on AB 3121, a legislative bill authored by California Secretary of State Shirley Weber and signed into passage by California Governor Gavin Newsom in September 2020. The law requires the 9-member task force to examine slavery that existed in the United States, discrimination in public and private sectors against those who were enslaved and their descendants, and lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery. The law requires the task force recommend how the state of California will issue a formal apology, how to eliminate discrimination in existing state laws, and how to establish new programs, policies, or projects to address the group's findings. The task force will also determine how any potential compensation should be calculated and who would be eligible, as well as additional forms of rehabilitation or restitution. The task force held its first substantive hearing on September 23rd and 24th, 2021, whereby we discussed the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and the impetus and implications of the Great Migrations. Expert witnesses for the September hearing included Isabel Wilkerson, John A. Powell, and Douglas Blackman. Today and yesterday, we are hosting our second substantive hearing on the contemporary harms against Black Americans, particularly in housing and education segregation, environmental racism, and today, racism in banking, tax, and labor, and the racial wealth gap. From a review of the agenda, you can see that it is a full agenda. To ensure that we complete it during the time allocated, we will need to make sure that we follow the timeline established. So to help us keep us on time, I'm asking for all of us to be mindful, and I'll remind us as well if we start to fall behind. As of this time, I would like to say welcome again, and we will now move forward with agenda item number 12, which is public comment. We reserve public comment for 9:05 to 10:05. It is now 9:04. So I will turn it to Ms. Martin Walton, who will commence our public comment period. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Moore. Good morning, task force members. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aisha Martin Walton. I am with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Enforcement Section, and we are now moving to public comment. Public comment will be for 1 hour. Each individual is limited to 3 minutes for public comment. At the 3-minute mark, your microphone will be turned off and you will not be able to turn yourself back on. However, there is a public comment period again at future meetings, and we welcome everyone in the community to make comments in the future. You may also submit written comments at any time via the email at reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov. To participate in public comment this morning, please use the raise hand function. You can find that button on the upper right-hand side of the screen. On the right side, there's a shape of a hand. Once you click on that, it will prompt the raised hand feature. On our end, we will accept the raised hand. Then you will get a notification at the top center of your screen to continue. You will have to click the continue button, and once you are accepted and brought into the meeting as a presenter, you will be automatically muted. Once it is your turn to comment, you will be unmuted and you will have 3 minutes to speak. At the end of your comment or at the 3-minute mark, you will be muted again and drop back down to attendee. We will accept the raise hand features as they come in. Once the person is in front of you is done speaking, we will say your name and prompt you, and you may begin speaking. Please note that there's a 20-second delay between the attendee and presenter mode, so please keep that in mind as you begin being prompted to presenter mode to prevent your public comments. So with that, let's see who is here to provide public comments today. So Tunji, will you please provide and promote the first speaker?
First, hello, Friday Jones. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
All right. Hi, I'm Friday Jones. My name is Kansa Jones Mohammed. I'm a city commissioner for the Mayor Garcetti's Los Angeles Reparations Task Force. I'm the co-chair of the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants in the Los Angeles chapter, and our local chapter is a member of a coalition for a just and equitable California. Eligibility. As a commissioner for Los Angeles, a prevalent thought in my mind is timeline and harm. Today, I'm testifying from Scotland, North Carolina. Outside of the only hotel in town are fields of cotton in full bloom. I am unapologetic in the recognition that 3 of my 4 grandparents are descended from enslaved ancestors who are chattel here in the United States. I'm mindful that my other grandparent, whose father hailed from Barbados, came to the United States in 1912, served in the United States Army at Camp Upton in New York, and whose mother was a full member of the Shinnecock Nation. Sorry, I got lost. The same nation that ultimately stripped her membership because she married outside of that nation. The same nation that would reclaim my grandmother and father, yet deny all of my father's children from membership in the Shinnecock Nation when their treaty with the United States was finalized. These nuances matter. These are the realities that you as commissioners will have to grapple with. Where slavery is concerned in the United States, my great-grandfather would not have a claim, nor would my great-grandmother born to the Shinnecock Nation. My great-grandfather entered the timeline of the United States in 1912. Did he live through Jim Crow and racist military service? Yes. It is your task to identify the nuance, not to create a one-size-fits-all tied to melanin or Blackness. That's very European and very American. Lineage and harm matter. The United States Office of Budget Management, which sets the standards for the census, cannot in a modern era grasp the reality that Black Americans of the descendant community have both a racial and ethnic identity. Because as a nation, whiteness has been the ultimate race barometer, and Blackness has been reduced to a singular, which it is not. It is multi-ethnic with nuances. Amber Ruffin recently did a video commentary of Black towns subject to racism and terrorism, where white mobs made lakes of the land. There was a list that scrolled through the towns where those communities were terrorized and flooded with water. The towns in California were Kennett, Baird, Elmore, Morley. I asked that this commission use the subpoena power to look into those towns, cities, and document where that power laid, how the people were affected by sheer racism. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Tunji, our next speaker.
Hello, Serge. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for allowing public comment and the comments from myself, especially. I'm a white conservative. Stereotypically, I'm not supposed to be in support of any type of reparations program or government action. I wanted to share my comments because through Clubhouse, I've been exposed to a lot of people who identify with the ADOS movement and the like. I'm not sure how how everyone on this panel might feel about that movement per se or lineage or whatever, but I just wanted to share that in being exposed to the movement, my political paradigm has totally been shifted, and I've been challenged in a number of ways for the good, and very much encouraged and challenged to do a lot more study on my own on a lot of the issues that are being discussed in this study or in this action. So to me, the question is not whether or not something like this should happen, but how reconciliation or recompense can occur. So I just wanted to share that as a white conservative. To me, this is of paramount importance for the state and the country to finally address. That's all I really wanted to say. I hope we can address things that have happened in our past to some degree and really reconcile and in good faith come together as one and heal finally and fully. That's all. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you so much, Serge, for those comments. Tunji, do we have another speaker?
Hello, Mary. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hi, can everyone see me?
No, we don't see you, but there you go. Now we can
Oh,
see
you
you
can see
and
me.
hear you.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Mary. Briefly, I'm on the other side of the country in Connecticut. And according to the new London mayor here, Connecticut is the third most segregated state in the country. I'm currently living in public housing, And even as a biracial, light-skinned red bone, I've been discriminated against on this property. I took legal action on my own without representation. It's currently still going on. There has been 2 discrimination complaints submitted to the Human Rights Commission in the state. Both were ignored. So racism is beyond someone within the community. It is on this state level. I've had many experiences in the state of Connecticut. This is just the most recent. I also like to say that my experience is unique, being as though I come from both white and Black heritage, and I'm quite frequently put in the category of white passing. White passing does not equal white passing treatment. When racist people look at me, they see Black and they treat me accordingly. Sorry, I'm just so upset.
Okay.
What I'm going through currently has been very traumatic in the state of Connecticut, and I had to fight on my own with no help. And they have a history of discrimination on this property. Luckily, some changes did happen thanks to me. I did contact the town select woman. She was not helpful at all, even though she had the power to appoint people on the commission, yet she doesn't have the authority to manage their behavior. So that's all I have to say, since I have 3 minutes, even though it's a long story.
It's all right, Mary. Thank you for coming on today. Thank you for calling. Thank you for supporting. And thank you so much for your comments. We really appreciate it. The task force really appreciates it.
Guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tunji, our next speaker, please.
Next, hello, Tony. Ray Harvey, you have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, yes, this is Antonio Ray Harvey, also known as Tony Harvey. I am a staff writer with California Black Media, and I have been viewing all the meetings up until now, 1 through 4. Well, this portion of it is getting started too, so I'll be on here for the next several hours, as you are 2 members of the task force, and God bless you all. The reason why I wanted to speak is I've been trying to reach you, Dr. Reverend Amos Brown. We're doing a series of profiles on the task members, and we would like to start with you first. So I've been trying to contact you. I don't know if you received any of those messages, but I'm gonna keep doing that. And I do want to start with you, and then we're gonna move on to Dr. Grills, and then hopefully I can get to Attorney Don Tamaki. Attorney Tamaki, I have been following Executive Order 9066. I learned about it when I was a journalism student at Sacramento State University, so I'm very much involved in that, especially around here in the Sacramento community, because there were a couple relocation camps, which I'm very familiar, and I visit time to time, and I do go to some of the events that is put on by the Japanese American Citizen League. So just want to let you know that. And Dr. Grills, I know you are associated with some of those activities that has to do with the Japanese American community too. But also, before I move on, I just want to share this with you, because I am a descendant of the Great Migration, which was spoke heavily in the last meeting. Originally, I'm from Illinois, but I've been living in Sacramento for the last 33 years. And what I learned from my people, I think I'm like the 2nd generation, but it's probably about 5 generations deep now in Illinois. My people was from Mississippi and Louisiana. And the illiterate ones, when they were making that migration back in the 40s up north, they could not read. So some of the people, including my family, were told, look for the CH to get to Chicago. Well, some of them didn't make it to Chicago. They read the CH, they understood that, but they ended up in Champaign, which also started with CH. So they ended up in Champaign and not in Chicago. I thought that was very interesting. I just wanted to share that with you because there's many various great stories about the Great Migration, and I would have to say that my family is one of them. Of course, I think I was conceived in Mississippi, but I was born in Illinois, and I just want to share that with you. I think the task force is doing a great job. I'm pretty impressed with the structure of how these meetings are been taking place. So I know it's a lot of work behind the scenes. So I will follow you for the next 6-7 meetings that there is until you make that proposal in January 2023. I'm off the air. God bless you all.
Thank you, Antonio. Thanks so much. Tunji, I think we're ready for our next speaker.
Hello, Chris. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, Coalition for Just and Equitable California. Big shout out to CJEC. Thank everybody for joining today, and big shout out to Tony. I know Tony's here in Sacramento. Tony who was just talking. Big shout out to California Black Media, Sacramento Observer, with Regina Wilson. I know we're going to talk a lot about Black media as these reparations conversations go on. Very much needed. So big shout out to Tony. Also to the woman who called in, who was our first caller. Thank you for calling in, and really, feel free to share your thoughts, and your comments and your thoughts to the task force directly, and be able to finish your story. And if there's anyone in Connecticut who's watching right now, please find that woman and connect with her, and let's get her some of the support that she needs, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing to say is a big shout out to ETM Media and the live stream right now going on in our YouTube channel. So big shout out to ETM Media. Also, I want to correct something that I said yesterday, or add something that I said yesterday about our community meeting coming up in Oakland, our second community meeting on November 6th. I want to share that and share more for also joining our prior community meeting in September. I don't think I said her name yesterday. And then also just to extend the invitation to Dr. Lewis, Mr. Tamaki, and I want to throw Dr. Brown, Mr. Brown in there too. I know he's in the Bay Area, and again, I know there's a 2-person rule, but Saturday, November 6th, if we can coordinate and get 2 of you there, whichever 2, that would be helpful. So thank you very much for that. I want to say a couple other things. One, I was a part of the team that helped write that special consideration language that's in AB 3121, myself and my good brother Marcus Champion, who may speak a little bit later today too. And I can tell you 100% that the interpretation that Assemblymember Reggie Jones Sawyer gave yesterday is the exact interpretation of what that language is about. The specific community that's of interest here are those who descend from U.S. slavery, and the interpretation is what Mr. Sawyer said, and I would urge us to stick to that. Last thing is, I do want to just talk real quick about how we have this conversation around eligibility. I think there's going to be some work that we have to do as a community, as my last seconds run out here, to actually have this conversation a way that brings us together and doesn't rip us apart as a people. There are real enemies of reparations, but those enemies are not other Black people and other Black organizations who are also fighting for reparations. When we get to the real enemies of reparations, we're going to need to be as strong as possible, and we're going to need each other. And that's important right now. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Chris, for your comments today. Tunji, our next speaker, please.
Hello, Tony. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Tony.
Good morning. I have been on the calls as most of the public speakers have been sharing, and I was one of the ones who did send an email to the DOJ And I sent several emails to legislatures and other folks throughout DOJ regarding the treatment of this committee. However, you're a specific DOJ representative. I sent my email to them directly and they did not respond, which was about 3 weeks ago. While I am very happy that you are on a good track now and that folks of this committee are now getting the perceived respect that they need and questions answered from the DOJ, I think that it's still to continue to push to make sure that the public is addressed directly by the emails that they do send. The other thing I want to let you all know is that this work is so important for folks on the ground who are Black individuals. Continue to push so that those documents are people of descent are able to find their roots and trace their lineage back. As I've been watching this, I did that and discovered 5 generations, and I am one of those folks who can trace back to African, the person who came from the motherland to here and started the lineage here on both sides of my family. So and it changed my whole perspective about who I am, what I am, and my voice and calling into this work. As many of your public speakers know, I've been a part of this work as an ethnic studies major and have worked with Japanese Americans, Dr. Greg Mark, and many on that end. And it's just so important that you continue to do this because whether you come from, and I'm going to stop here, but whether you come from the continent in the 80s or whether you come as a descendant of a slave 5 generations down, this has affected us in ways that we have only begun to discuss. And as someone said, if somebody wants to arrest you because you're Black, they're not going to stop and say, oh, what dialect do you speak? Or what are you mixed with? Or who are you married to? What color is the person that you're married to? They don't care. You're Black first and everything else after that. So this work hopefully will help for our babies to not have to go through this again and again and again. That we are human beings, that we do have a standing, that we do possess a space in this country and have contributed in ways that people have just begun to understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for your comments today. Tunji, our next speaker, please.
Hello, Ade Jackson. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Ade.
Good morning, everybody. I was just calling into the commission to continue to encourage the work that you are doing. I've often thought as a young person born and raised in Sacramento, California, why, areas and neighborhoods that are known as, South Sac or South Sac, Iraq, locally, like why they haven't changed in over 20 years. And now almost going into my 3rd decade, things are still very rough in that area. And it happens to be where a lot of the Black community lives. Now seeing that this conversation is being had about reparations and redistributing resources, I kind of understand that there's now an opportunity to do some of that transformative work to improve the areas and communities in the places where we come from and the places where individuals like us and those that are not like us are located. And I think being a critical leader requires using the transformative tools that we have, as well as thinking transformatively about the systems and institutions that we're a part of. That's why I encourage these efforts to develop resources and tools to really combat and challenge the status quo that often leaves Black communities specifically behind, whether that's through systemic racism, generational wealth, or contemporary outgrowths from America's history of enslavement. And I see this commission's work as extremely vital. I'll continue to pay attention, and I'll just continue to encourage everybody to keep doing the work to make Black Lives Matter and continue to reimagine public safety as is involved in that process. So just wanted to encourage the work you all are doing. I'll definitely stay in tune with what's going on here. And yeah, I appreciate the time that everybody has. And, you know, this is the work that it takes to make Black Lives Matter. So I hope everybody has a good day, and I will continue to stay in touch. And yeah, I'm Ade Jackson. I'm an attorney out of LA, also an organizer with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And, you know, this is a great commission. Keep up the great work. Hopefully we can work together soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ade. Tunji, do we have another speaker?
Next, we have Chad. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning, members of the task force. Thank you once again for giving your time to this historic effort and initiative. You are greatly appreciated by our community. I just quickly wanted to, and again, I'm a board member of Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, as well as a board member of the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants in Los Angeles. I just wanted to echo the comments that you've heard from others that I work closely with, like Chris Lodson and Marcus Champion, who did work directly on the development of that special consideration language that currently appears in AB 3121. They are speaking straight to the spirit that Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber intended in that language, as did Assemblymember Jones Sawyer. And I would encourage this panel to bring Secretary of State Dr. Weber in to give her own personal views and what she thought when she crafted that language, because I do think that while we can interpret it, she can speak best to it. And speaking just quickly on lineage specificity, Chairwoman Moore spoke very eloquently yesterday about the differentials in wealth position that were viewed in the Color of Wealth report that came out of the UCLA. Dr. William Darity worked on that. And as she said, there are wide gulfs in wealth position between Native Black Americans and Black immigrants that recently came to this country. So there is a nuanced conversation to have here around eligibility, and I applaud how you have already undertaken this conversation and just charged head on into it. I would encourage you to continue to do so. But on the note of disaggregation, I did want to bring something to your attention, because previously when I called in, I talked about low-hanging fruit. And on Friday, Governor Newsom vetoed House Assembly Bill 105, which CJEC worked hard to get disaggregation language into that bill, which would allow the state to improve their data collection practices to really give the true view of our condition here in California versus others within the larger Black community. So I think that this panel has the opportunity to not only gather, collect information, but also take political and legislative action in the process, supporting bills like AB 105, which we will be reintroducing in the next legislative session. And thank you, Senator Bradford and Assemblymember Jones Sawyer, for your support of that bill. We want to see better data. We have to be able to view our true condition in order to develop effective policy and legislative measures and measure the outcomes and impact of those initiatives. So please focus on eligibility, on specificity, but also on disaggregation and the data collection practices of this state that we need to implement and improve to make sure that what we are doing is targeting and reaching the correct communities. So thank you again. Have a great meeting today.
Chad, thank you so much. The task force really appreciates your comments. All right. Tunji, do we have another speaker?
Good morning, Angela Nirvana. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Yes, hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Education is great. We especially need to teach our history to our children, since some in this country pretend we are the racists or wanting our kids to be taught true American history, which includes our never-ending Holocaust. But education doesn't guarantee employment. given that our affirmative action benefits everyone but us, nor does it close the over $100 trillion egregious racial wealth gap. We've got 900,000 kids, 25 and under here in California, and of 215,000 teachers, roughly 12,000 or 5.5% are Black. 22,000 of our kids are in foster care. Our youth make up 15% of youths nationwide, and yet 41% are detained. I'm asking yet again, even though we all suffer from racism, who's impacted by foster care and the preschool to prison pipeline? Nigerians with a $72,000 wealth position per the 2004 Color of Wealth LA report, some of whom descend from slave traders who chose to migrate here, or ADOX, whose ancestors were sold into chattel slavery with a $3,500 wealth position, or 4.5% of Nigerian wealth in the country our ancestors built with their lives. What you are contemplating with our reparations and sharing it with Black immigrants is akin to another white wealth transfer, which clearly has already been done in education and the workforce, both in the public and private sectors per our affirmative action. Class-based policies don't fix race. When you elevate everyone, ADOX is still on the bottom. Furthermore, I don't recall any other group having to share their reparations with migrants. In closing, it is evident by the wealth position of immigrants, including the Black ones, and the wealth position of whites, that ADOX is clearly their reparations. It is time for ADOX to take care of ADOX. No other group is as oppressed, and everyone eats from the wealth our ancestors generated with their lives, but us, their descendants. I thank you for your exemplary work on this task force and for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nirvana, for your comments today. Tunji, next speaker, please.
Hello, Frank Elmore. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm trying this again. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Frank.
Oh, cool. Okay. All right, yeah, I tried to get in yesterday and was very unsuccessful. But anyhow, it's going to be easier for me to just read my concerns here. One of my initiatives for American Africans, not African Americans, who are Betos, that is Black American descendants of slaves, is that we receive necessary compensations from the United States to expense the invoice of providing funds to cover the cost of ancestry searches. The obvious purpose and goal is to support the search of Betos, which is Black American descendants of slaves, to determine our African roots. I wrote a letter to President Biden, and very quickly, I think I can cover it in 3 minutes. Dear President Biden, I pray this letter finds you well. The issue of reparations for the atrocities committed to and against enslaving Black Africans is an immediate and pervasive topic for many descendants of those enslaved Africans. I represent a category of descendants of those enslaved Africans, the American African Ancestry, AAA. It is interesting that I claim to be of African ancestry, but I do not have a clue where my ancestral line originates. My ancestors were kidnapped, stolen, and sold into chattel slavery. Somewhere it all began with my African ancestors, but I do not know where. It is maddening for me to feel so lost and bereft of my true lineage and geographical origin. I present the foregoing as a premise for my writing you. Yes, I'm a reparationist, but reparations for Black American Africans is such a vague notion with few, if any, concrete and substantiated claims. My proposal focuses on a particular aspect of reparations. Reparations, in short, requires the actions of an offending party, the United States of America, to make overtures to repair and make whole the harms caused by the offender, USA, inflicted upon enslaved Africans, subsequently their descendants. The personal injuries are incalculable. Our first demand for reparations is simple. We posit that the United States of America owes all Black American Africans the order of providing all expenses related to our ancestral searches that will determine exactly where our ancestors were stolen, kidnapped, and otherwise unlawfully removed from. Moreover, that will result in our enhanced personal identities of where our origins and where we might return. We begin at the beginning, where in Africa we were stolen, kidnapped, and otherwise unlawfully removed from. This is our first demand for reparations, available for further discussion and concept development. I am now in what's called Coachella Valley, a city in Coachella Valley, but I spent a lot of years in
Mr. Elmore, this is Aisha. I'm so sorry to have to
it's
cut you
okay.
off
I'm
in the
done.
middle of your, oh, that's okay, but remember,
Appreciate you guys. Keep on doing what you're doing.
and feel free to come back for another public comment period at a future meeting. All right, thank you. Tunji, our next speaker.
Next, we have Don Alston Page. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, panel, task force. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. I wanted to call back in. Yesterday, I was speaking about how universalism had been the bane of our existence here in America as descendants of chattel slavery. I was a bit disturbed by members' grills and holders' confusion over who should be eligible for reparations. And I thought that that was very concerning. I think it's very clear that we are, this entire process was undertaken to address the debt that is owed to Black American descendants of chattel slavery, and that we are contemplating using our reparations claim as some sort of community development program, or as some sort of way to fix the education system, or some way to fix the police. That's not what the process is. That's not what we're here for. We're not here to fix everyone else with a debt that's owed to us. I wanted to also point out the history that was just brought out right in this session about the Department of Justice and their history of obstruction of justice. And I also want to point out that if we look at the profile of those who own slaves, we'll find that 40% of slaveholders were white women. And I just find it ironic that that is also the profile, you know, in terms of the demographic of who is teaching our children. But I just want to also point out that Kamala Harris and Obama both had parents who were here during the 60s, Black immigrants who obviously were allowed to attend colleges that we couldn't. So there is a difference, and I hope that we understand that and respect what we're all doing here. And that's why I would urge the task force to sooner rather than later determine the eligibility and to ensure that it is for Black American descendants of chattel slavery only and does not include any other groups such as immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Thanks for your comments today. Tunji, do we have another speaker?
Hello, John Mudd. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I want to echo the sentiments of specificity in regards to who would be eligible for this claim. And I just wanted to kind of be clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about a claim that is in regards to slavery, exclusion from the Homestead Act, reneging on the obligation of 40 acres and a mule, Black Code laws, convict leasing, peonage, denial of New Deal benefits, racial covenants, segregation, redlining, and I could go on. But there's only one group who has been targeted by all of these things. And I think that people who are trying to bring all these other groups into our reparation claim are doing something completely different than any other reparations claim that has been paid out by this country. Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans face discrimination in this country, but it was the Japanese who received reparation for the internment camps. And then you have the Aleuts, who are the Alaska Natives who are also affected during World War II, who had a separate claim. When we look at the reparations that Native Americans received, not all Native Americans received reparations, but many Native American tribes have received reparations, and each tribe had their own specific claim. So I think that if you want to say that there are other groups who were harmed, they have to come up with their own claim in regards to reparations. But if we're going to speak specifically on the things that I listed out as the harms that were targeted towards my group of people, the people who descend from American chattel slavery, then we have to be very specific about that group and only focus on that group. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. Tunji, do we have another speaker?
Next to speak, we have Davenport Law Lobbying. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
To God be the glory for this opportunity. Please shake your hand and give me a hand raise if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so general public, great task force. I appreciate you all for just taking any time to deal with the public, right? You can check me out, davenportlawlobbying.com, and get the resume. My sister's a lawyer, my mom's a lobbyist. We're God-fearing people who do good work, right? We don't go in the barbershop and talk about things that should be done politically and then come to people's task force during public comments and confuse people, right? So I understand there's a federal claim that's going on in reference to slavery, but everyone on this task force understands what the law is in California, right? And moving forward, henceforth, I'm gonna use the term human trafficking because that's what it really is. So California failed to protect human trafficking victims that came in the country, and that was wrong. That's the claim, okay? But more specifically, we also got to make sure we don't focus only on the past and we focus on the present. We already got the calculations, the assessments, right? I honestly feel like it's a waste of time how this task force is leading things, but then I have to remind myself, you know, you can't cut anybody out, Mr. Davenport. Other people are on the third grade level in this reparations struggle. So this is my point. CA AAGRA has the expertise in handling all these things that I'm just going to blow your mind with. Freeman, ADOS, BAADOS. Did you even know that existed? How about this? SCAADOS. All this stuff. Your people at the bunch organization is good, but I've reviewed the website. They're not prepared. 800, whatever the amount of money is, less than $1 million is crazy. 765 is less than 2 cents a person. Let's get those numbers up. Let's get the money to the people who skill, and we're going to get this done the right way. I love y'all. God bless you. God bless America. Make sure y'all keep having fun. Peace.
Thank you so much for your comments today. All right. Tunji, do we have other speakers? Tunji, do we have anyone else who would like to speak today?
Yes, we have Sharice Sear. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Sharice Cryer. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Sharice.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Sharice Cryer. I'm a SoCal resident, SoCal native, and also descendant of American slavery on both sides, both maternal and paternal sides of my family. I just wanted to congratulate the task force on the awesome job that you are doing. Watching these public hearings and public comment the last few weeks has really been great and eye-opening to see the development of this process. So I wanted to ask a question. What is the task force and the GOJ taking into consideration from public comments? The same people are calling over and over again, the same passionate people and are asking the same things. I've sent several emails to the DOJ task force email address, and it seems like some of the concerns or questions are not necessarily being addressed. I know one of the task force members mentioned something that someone spoke about yesterday from the public comments, but it would really be helpful to see what the DOJ and task force are taking into consideration from the public. The next thing is you cannot speak on eligibility for reparations until you define what reparations is. And I'm going to point out Evanston, Illinois, they decided that reparations was going to be real estate payment. And so while we're talking about who is eligible for reparations in the state of California, you really need to define what reparations is before or during the time that you're trying to determine eligibility. Finally, I'm going to call out Dr. Kramer because I feel I've sat on 2 panels with him, and he's very nice, super intelligent, and I feel comfortable calling him out. But I'm going to ask the task force to please ask Dr. Kramer today, or when he speaks, what is reparations, and ask who is eligible for reparations. And I would ask the task force to continue to ask expert witnesses so that you can actually get a better idea of what reparations should be and who's eligible. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ms. Cryer. Tunji, we have time for more speakers.
Good morning, Antonio Thomas. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, everybody. My name is Antonio Thomas, and I am a descendants of American slavery, ADOS, and I'm also freedman. It was established in 1865, which is Frederick Douglass, Prince Rivers, Hiram Revels, and Harriet Tubman also was freedmen due to the act that the 13th, 14th Amendment has the blueprint for freedmen to be a federally protected class that is under Special Field Order number 15, Series 1865, where the military order was given in the Civil War, which Adolf/freemen were the people who fought for their own independence, and each bill was set by Congress. And I would like the task force to look into all those bills and laws that's already set on civil rights in 1865, which was redone in 1965, that gave women and other groups the same level of bereavement that we were supposed to get, and to look into those civil rights acts and be very specific when you come to de-aggregating our numbers, verifying our delineation, and using us as a protected class. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for your comments today. Tunji, is there anyone else waiting?
Hello, Robert Kaylin Reed. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Robert.
All right, I'm with my grandmother and she's sleeping, so I'm going to try to make this quick. First of all, I would again like to ask the commission to try and get attorney Antonio Moore on as an expert witness. I think he does a very good job at laying out the narrative of why reparations is such an important issue of the time. And I think based on the work he's done, based on the numbers and the data that he's compiled, he paints a pretty compelling picture. And so I would really like to see him on as a witness. I also understand that the commission is going to vote on the chat. I really urge a yes vote for the chat function to be restored. There were a lot of answers to some of the discussion that was had yesterday evening that people wanted to answer in real time, answers about the subpoena powers and where we would like to see subpoena power legislated or given so that we can receive data, whether we're talking about discrimination against Black farmers, whether we're talking about housing, credit and loans, and things like the banking institutions. In real time, I don't know if there's a miscommunication between the DOJ and the commission, and I understand that they came to clear up some of that yesterday. But if anything else, if you guys can see the chat in real time, then you know where some of the audience and community members are going. And so you would have some kind of just something to go off of. And so I really urge a yes vote for the chat to be restored. And that's about all I have to say on that.
Thank you, Mr. Kalen Reed, for your comments this morning. Junji, is there anyone else?
Hello, Amaru Young. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning, Honorable Reparations Task Force, California. My name is Amaru. As was stated, I'm a board member of the NCEEJ.org based in California. I say honorable because the job that you're tasked with is the most honorable one in the United States of America, history outside of the Civil War. I want to co-sign Angela Navana's statements because although there are other groups within America that have suffered from racism in this country, no other group has suffered and continue to suffer as much as the American descendants of slaves. Again, I plead with the board not to delay in identifying this group that is in question. I also plead with the board to not allow justice claimed due to the American descendants of slavery be all lives matter when ensuring that true justice is done. The American descendants of slavery can no longer be the mule for all groups of oppressed people in this country, meanwhile being left in the bottom of a real-life caste system. Also, when it comes to understanding the debt that is owed to the American descendants of slaves, it will not be satisfied through education, nor the uplifting of marginalized community, especially when those communities are now being gentrified. When the gentleman was speaking about integration communities, he failed to bring home the message of the lack of resources that was given to said Black communities. If those resources were allocated to our Black communities, we will continue to have the Black Wall Streets that was destroyed through white supremacy and terrorism. The level of reparations owed to ADOS should exceed the $6.3 billion that was just recently given to the Afghans for their participation in serving in the United States interests in Afghanistan, especially since our efforts was for the salvation of the United States itself. I would like to bring this message home even further. We are not people of color. We are not BIPOC. We are the American descendants of slaves who built this country, who fought in every war since this country existence. And we ask that this board take that into consideration when determining who should receive the reparation. And we also ask this board to get a true or better understanding of reparation that's owed to us. It's not something that's going to take care of all of this country ills, but it is something that is due and owed to the American descendants of slave. And I ask that this board take that into consideration as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. It is 9:57 and we have time for a few more speakers. Tunji, do we have anyone else who would like to speak?
Yes, our next speaker, Kosh Gaines, you have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Again, hugs to everyone on the task force and to Mr. Tamaki, a deep bow. I want to say that first, again, as everyone has reiterated, y'all are so important to us in modern day, especially with the specificity, because semantics has been played on us over and over again and to our detriment. And when it comes time for 250 years, Black Americans prevented from being able to read and write, I thought affirmative action was meant to fix us specifically. But reading it now, I understand, and also having realized that the biggest receivers of affirmative action, as I've mentioned before, are white women and white men who identify as homosexual. The truth is that affirmative action has not helped the Black American community. We were trying to reach out and be on some all lives matter, as was said earlier, intersectionality. With racism, it's the same thing. We should be specific to those who've been harmed and not try to help everyone, as those are separate issues. What we're talking about is not discrimination, but surviving economic attacks. Maybe that's another way to look at it. I just want to say, maybe facetiously, as a Black American, it makes me feel a type of way when people try to chalk up the Black experience to white folks see us all as criminals. I want to make it very clear that when people immigrate to America who look Black, they are criminalized, as the 13th Amendment allows criminals to be slaves. But I hope people can say in the same breath that looking Black also makes you look cool, and also makes you a part of the Buy Black movement, since people are disproportionately supporting those businesses. I'm tired of us trying to fix everyone else with the debt that's owed to us specifically. It's been to our detriment over and over again. By 2023, you guys are going to be able to actually help with domestic tranquility in America. So again, I uplift you with special consideration being mentioned in this bill from the origin. In my mind, from the beginning, that was the inheritance owed to the slave descendants, the cash payments of direct cash payments, as well as the land. And lastly, I want to say that we don't want no surveys. We don't want no either or. It needs to be yes and. Please be yes and. And it needs to be 800 credit score resets, direct cash payments with lump sum options, and perpetual dividends from the green rush. And I want my 40 acres and a Tesla. And thank you guys again. Much love.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines. It looks like we have about 6 minutes, so that would be 2 people. Tunji, can you share with the task force how many people are waiting in the queue?
We currently have 2 people in the queue.
Okay, all right, next speaker, please.
Next, we have Enzyma Griffin. You have been muted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you, Enzyma. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm Nzinga Griffin. I'm a 3rd generation ADOS California resident. And, you know, we do know that the harms that were done as far as slavery have been done only to the American descendants of chattel slavery. And it's ridiculous that someone else would be.
It looks like we should have about 14 people.
Hello? All right. Let's try that again. Tunji, can you bring Nzinga forward? We lost her.
I believe she was disconnected.
Ooh, okay. All right.
We can go to our next speaker.
Yes, please.
Next, hello, Ernest. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning, task force members. My name is Ernest Russell, and I am a descendant of American chattel slavery and U.S. freedmen. I'm calling today to advocate for reparations and ask the task force to support reparations that is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, basically a SMART goal. I advocate for a yes vote on enabling the chat, just for reasons of supporting free speech and allowing others to, you know, weigh in on the process in case they aren't able to. I did want to leave the task force with some words from Dr. King from a speech that he wrote as it relates to reparations. Some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they agree, but he should ask for nothing more. On the surface, this appears reasonable, but it is not realistic. For it is obvious that if a man is entered at the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, the first would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. In 2016, California Governor Jerry Brown signed AB 1726, which was a bill that would require the Department of Public Health to break down demographic data it collects by ethnicity or ancestry for Native Hawaiian, Asian, and Pacific Islander groups. This is the perfect example of why delineation and disaggregation matters. According to activists who supported the bill, better data on the different needs of our community translates to more effective public policies that save lives. AB 1726 allowed a clearer pathway to formulate policies focused on positive outcomes for specific communities. Not only do I support the legislation, I believe more legislation like it needs to follow for Black Americans, specifically those who can trace their ancestry to those who were enslaved in this country. It is important that we recognize all communities are unique and have specific needs that are aligned with the history that they have in this country. When it comes to reparations, it is important that we recognize that those who suffered the harms of the claim discussed in these sessions are those who deserve the sole focus of compensation and repair. If a broad approach is taken, we run the risk of trying to heal rotten gunshot wounds with a Band-Aid, which is what America and the California government has attempted to do since freeing the formerly enslaved citizens. The Black American community, with its ancestral ties to American chattel slavery and Jim Crow, are owed reparations. It is the only remedy that can heal the systemic ills, be they de jure or de facto, against Black Americans. Due to 246 years of brutal enslavement, the rape of Black women for the pleasure of white men, and to produce more enslaved workers, the selling off of Black children, indentured servitude, lynching, mob violence, sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, mandatory segregation, Black codes, bans on Black jury service, bans on voting, imprisoning people unpaid, medical sterilization and experimentation.
Excuse me, Mr. Russell, I'm so sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your sentence and your thoughts.
I'll end by saying this. You can't heal our community without being specific. And again, you're trying to put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound and it's not going to work. So I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your comments. Chair Moore, apparently we have a couple more people in the queue, but we have time in terms of our 1 hour limit for one more person. Tunji, how many people do we have actually?
Aisha, we currently have 4 in the queue.
That would put us over about 12 minutes or so. I mean, it would be 12 minutes for all 4 folks. Or we can invite folks back at the next meeting, December 7th and 8th.
Well, let's just take the rest of the comments because I'll make the announcement at our first panel of the day, but there's one panelist that won't be able to join us.
Okay.
And so there's some time. Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, next speaker, Tunji.
Next, we have Danielle Eaves. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for the time this morning, Task Force. I thank everyone for dedicating your time to make sure that the proper repairs and justices are done for the American descendants of slaves. I want to take the time to appreciate the Task Force in such a thorough and wonderful job. I'm just going to restate and reiterate a couple of things already said and just kind of put some things up. I have sent a formal written request for delineation to the task force specifically. And I just want to give a brief description of what that is. Me being a studying genealogist, not quite certified, but working on it. I learned a lot of things about the American descendants of slaves that are not properly being told in our history. Part of the great injustice of what has been done to us is actually the denial, erasure, and eradication of our history and true lineage throughout America. What I would request of the task force is to consider who should be repaired. The specific and sole repairs should consider the time of 1789, from when our Constitution was ratified, through 1865, when those harms were ended in the form of slavery. In that you have various different avenues of how you become an American slave. Those Black, mulatto, even people of color, but they were all slaves. The harms that continue to proceed unto today through Jim Crow, Reconstruction, redlining, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, Iran-Contra, etc., were specific and direct to a specific set of people formerly known as slaves. Those things were done to people who are now being reclassified as African American and or Black. With the erasure of our history through the hands of President Barack Hussein Obama, by strengthening the word Negro, it has ultimately placed us in a position to have to self-identify. That self-identification we'd like to use is the American Descendants of Slavery, ADOS. It is the only thing that would encompass all that we are. It speaks to people who can find themselves between 1850 and 1880 U.S. Census as Black, Negro, mulatto, or people of color. And these people also still identify as African American and or Black today, even ADOS on U.S. Census as of the last 10 to 15 years. I submit this evidence as a studying genealogist and ask that the task force receive it in good faith. I thank you for all your work, and I've landed. Have a great day.
Thank you, Ms. Eaves. We appreciate your comments. All right, I think we're going to accept 3 more speakers. Tunji, who is next?
Next, we have back Nzinga Griffin. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me? Because I don't know the. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Nzinga.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, so this is Nzinga Griffin. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Task Force, for all that you're doing in this work. I'm 3rd generation ADOS California resident. And as I was saying before, the harms from the slavery in the United States were done towards American descendants of slavery. Obviously, those are the only victims of slavery here, and we should not be having to share reparations with other groups for slavery. They should be setting up claims to get slavery reparations from those that enslaved them, like the CARICOM efforts. I don't think those are being shared with members of ADOS. It's only for those that were enslaved, you know, in those areas there, and it's not being shared with other ones, and we shouldn't be required to do that either. Some of the people that would be getting reparations as well are even descendants of slaveholders, and that wouldn't be right either. Another comment I have is please turn the chat back on, vote for it to be turned on. It's very useful during these meetings. As you can see, there's only 100 people here. There might be about 50 listening in other avenues. It's not enough people. The public should be engaged. There should also be an afternoon comment section so that you guys can keep up with the community, knowing what the community is feeling and wanting in regards to this effort that you guys are doing. Yesterday, I heard some people come on mentioning Habitat for Humanity, CAL, HFA, Section 8, and other pipeline systems for things like housing. And you guys have talked about things like education, but what are the stats for Habitat for Humanity? How many ADOS families have they helped? What about CAL, HFA? How many mortgages have they given out to ADOS families? Maybe we can have those stats before we willy-nilly go about giving out contracts and agreements to people to service these things that you guys are looking for to be remedied. We need to make sure that we have grassroots organizations involved in anchoring these efforts. One group that I do recommend as a member of the ADOS lineage community, I trust CA to coordinate all paid labor for the community engagement job plans. I have met with one of the board members and he knows our issues. He wants to hire ADOS to do this work. That will ensure the wealth gap is not widened as we work for our justice claim. This is an immediate way to get us help by you're all endorsing the CAAGRA to lead the paid community engagement work. I think if this is our ADOS justice claim, we should lead the paid work. We should be the leaders, the ones getting this information out to the communities, even as an anchor organization. So I do support Mr. John Burgess in the California AAGRA. He promised us he would lead, and this is exciting that he feels that ADOS should lead the way. So please make the CA.
Ms. Griffin, I'm so sorry to have to interrupt you in the middle of your sentence and thought. Thank you so much for your comments this morning. And we will take our last 2 speakers. Tunji, who is next?
Next, we have Brandon. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. This is not about people who chose to immigrate to this country under the guise of American dream. And when they got here, they still have suffered and had to deal with things. This is about the people who were stolen and sold and robbed of their land. Their culture was beaten out of them, and then they've had to endure everything ever since. It's a culmination of things. This is about a certain lineage who did not choose to immigrate to this country for a better life, but one was robbed of life. So we have to really look at this holistically, and I want everyone to understand this country won't be made whole until these people are addressed. And California is on the block, so everyone is going to base their thing off of what happens here. It's very important to get it right. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brendan. All right, we will hear now from our very last speaker.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Hello, this is Mintz. Is it okay for me to?
Yes, you have been promoted to presenter.
Thank you. Okay, so when reparations is mentioned in regard to freedmen and or ADOS counterparts, education is typically mentioned as a form of repair. Despite the fact most education learned about reparations, injustices, and true history are acquired outside of the existing institutions and research conducted externally from colleges and universities, we must take a look at the data and current circumstances to address the problems, as we know their root cause, which obviously was mentioned in the previous responses. We clearly understand the root cause, and as it stands today, even with more education and access to educational resources, our experiences remain the same. Financial literacy, education, and community developmental incentives will not solve nor repair the freedmen community. What needs to be addressed is the experience lost and currently not granted due to sabotage plans, false promises throughout history, and practices allowed and never addressed. This effort must be reparative and experience-driven, as others who were not victims did not receive their liberties limited and guided. We were restricted in every sector of society: learning and education, communities and media, art and culture, economics and business, peace building and relations, justice and governance, health and wellness, food, water, and environment, as Flint is a perfect example. We must be granted fair access and equal opportunity, and neither can be provided without reparations being free and not guided and limited. And it has to be repetitive. It has to be repetitive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mins, so much for your comments. Thank you all. Thank you for your comments to the task force today. We have reached the allotted time for public comments. If you were not able to provide a comment, we invite you to attend future public meetings. The next meeting will be December 7th and 8th. And please, at any time, feel free to submit written comments or testimony via email at reparationstaskforce@glj.ca.gov. And with that, I will now turn the meeting back over to Chair Moore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Martin Walton, for facilitating public comment today. Really appreciate you. So moving forward to agenda item number 13, witness panel 3, where we will be discussing racism in banking, tax, and labor. And this panel will run to 12:05, and then we will have lunch from 12:05 to 1 p.m. So at this time, I would like to remind each witness panel that their testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. I'd also like to make an announcement that David Smith, who was scheduled to give personal testimony, he is a retired airline pilot who has served in the United States Air Force and the Texas National Guard. He served on the Sacramento County Grand Jury in 2008, and he is an area director for the NAACP. And he had family members, particularly his father, who was a Tuskegee Airman. He had a family emergency, so he will no longer be able to speak today. But hopefully, if able, we can bring him back for a future hearing. Now I will introduce our panelists who are here and ready to provide expert and personal testimony. The first expert witness that we will hear from today is Dr. Williams Briggs. Dr. Williams Briggs is a professor in the Department of Economics at Howard University and was formerly the chair of the Department of Economics. He currently serves as chief economist to the AFL-CIO. Previously, he served as the assistant secretary for the Office of Policy at the United States Department of Labor under President Barack Obama's administration. The next person we will hear in terms of expert testimony is Dr. Jacqueline Jones. Dr. Jacqueline Jones is a professor of history at the University of Texas, Austin. She is the author of several books, including Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family, From Slavery to the Present, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won the Bancroft Prize. Our last speaker will be Lawrence Lucas. Lawrence Lucas is the President Emeritus for the United States Department of Agriculture Coalition of Minority Employees, which represents thousands of employees within the USDA and also advocates on behalf of farmers unfairly impacted by the department's practices. Mr. Lucas has testified before houses of Congress about discrimination faced by USDA employees and the farmers they serve. And between 11:35 and 12:05, we will hear from Mirza Baradaran. Mirza Baradaran is a professor of banking law, financial inclusion, inequality, and the racial wealth gap at the University of California, Irvine Law School. Her book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, was awarded the Best Book of the Year by the Urban Affairs Association. After we hear from Mirza Baradaran, we will turn to the task force for comments and questions. Without further ado, I would like to turn the mic over to Dr. Williams Briggs, who will have 20 minutes to provide expert testimony. Dr. Spriggs, you may begin when you're ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair Moore, and thank you, Vice Chair Brown and members of the committee. I appreciate your time. I apologize to you that I didn't get this to you in advance, but I do want to do this with PowerPoint. I think pictures will be very helpful in explaining what I want to try and convey. So my task was to share with you a view of why labor matters in this equation. So I'm going to go through some of the institutional forces that have shaped Black earnings before 1940, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. Could you please confirm that you're seeing the screen? Because of the way this works, I can't see. Or do you see it?
Confirmed. Okay,
thank you. So this is the path of wage gaps since 1980. You can see the dark blue line at the top. This is the wage gap of Black men compared to white men. This gap has increased. This is the average hourly wage gap. It's gone from a little over 22% to well over 30% in that time period. If you adjust for education, occupation, education, region of residence, whether they're metro or not, and only look at full-time workers, you see that the gap is 22%. That's the light blue line. For Black women, this is full-time, part-time, everybody. The raw gap has climbed to 19% higher. And then this is the gap for, that's against white women. And then the blue line at the bottom is Black women compared to white women, adjusting for education, occupation, etc. It's important to take note of the light blue line and the red line, sort of the lighter red line, because these control for education. This is the difference in the returns to skill acquisition. So when people think that if we only look at education, if we compensate for educational differences, we will have solved the problem. As you can see, you clearly would not solve the problem. When you look at the wealth gap, what you're looking at is a cumulative function made up of initial wealth holding going back to 1865, the returns to those wealth holdings, plus the returns to the savings from income and from income generated from wealth, savings from the income generated from wealth. So if there's a wage gap, there will be a savings gap. Blacks and whites have virtually the same savings rates. So if you make less money, your aggregate savings will be less because you have less to save from. That gets compounded. So this 31%, or if you prefer to look at it from the viewpoint of a Black man with the same education, living in the same area with the same background, every hour they are 22% behind. Their savings get compounded year after year after year, and that explodes into the wealth gap. So that's why it's important to understand the wage gap. I'm going to show you this slide because I want to take you back a little bit further, because you saw that there was already a gap at the beginning in 1980. If we go back to 1940, you see there is still a gap. The line at the top are white men at the top of the white income distribution. These are those, and these are annual salaries, those who are at the top 10%, the 90th quintile. If you look just below that, these are the top earners for Black men. And you can see the gap. In 1940, at the top, white men made almost twice as much as the highest earning Black men, $40,000 compared to $20,000. For those at the median, these are the blue dashed lines. The blue dashed lines with the triangles are white men at the median, so it's more or less the typical person, right half below, half above. And then the blue dashed lines with the black dots, these are Black men at the median. And you see repeated again this gap. White men at the median were making close to 20,000, Black men at the median close to 10,000, roughly twice the amount. You see these lines move pretty much in parallel. There's some gains made for Black men at the very high end, but these gaps are moving kind of in parallel. That's because there are structures already built in. And these structures are what you have to interrupt. But these structures and these pay gaps are brought forward because, again, the savings from that time period get compounded into the wealth of today. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples, and I'm going to start with the concentration of an example dealing with actions of the state to create these wage structures. I'm going to give you a concrete example of actions of workers against other workers, and then an example of companies working against workers. I was asked to try and make this a little personal, so I'm going to start with that. This is a picture of my great-great-grandfather. That's the gentleman there at the bottom. This picture was taken in Beggs, Oklahoma. It was at the funeral of my great-great-grandmother. The woman on the far right is my great-grandmother, Matilda Spriggs. The gentleman to her immediate right, you know, the picture going left of her, is going to be important for this story because that's Isaac James, who was a locomotive fireman at the time of this picture. And the gentlewoman who is in front of my great-grandmother on the right, the shorter woman, is Emma James Wade. She's going to be important for this story at the moment that I'm going to talk about. She was a school teacher in Alabama, a certified school teacher in 1899 in Alabama. When we look at the 1940s, This was the occupation teaching of Blacks who had college degrees for the most part. Well over half of Blacks were teachers if they had a college degree. 76% of Blacks with a bachelor's degree were teachers if they lived in the South. 28% of all Blacks were teachers in the South. This is key because it gets to state action. State action. This is discrimination that limited the mobility of educated Blacks, the most educated, those with a college degree, before 1940. If we look at what that pay looked like, this is 1940 pay of college graduates. These are sort of major occupations that college graduates had at the time. You will see the red line indicates the pay for teachers. And if you look in the South, you see that white teachers with college degrees were paid about $1,200 a year in 1940, compared to Blacks who are paid somewhere close to $760 a year. Outside the South, you see that Blacks did better, but that's a clear indication of what's going on here. If Blacks would move to the outside of the South as teachers, they gain quite a bit in pay. In fact, they would be paid much more than white college educated teachers in the South. Why didn't they just move? And this gets to the act of discrimination in hiring Black teachers. The primary role of Black teachers was to teach Black school children in the South. And so they were constrained, they were prevented from taking their skills and their talent across state lines and enjoying their skills. Oddly, the most skilled workers in this scenario didn't migrate. Now, this shows you the distribution of teachers. This is with some college, because in the 1940s, there were still people who had teacher certificates. They didn't require a full bachelor's degree. The black lines represent the Black teachers. The red lines represent white teachers. The axis on the top is telling you how many teachers there are for Blacks, and the bottom for white teachers. And you can see that Blacks are heavily concentrated in the South. This isn't simply because the Black population is concentrated in the South. It's because Black teachers teach Black kids. They are concentrated in the South. You will notice that in the 1940s 1% census, there are no Black teachers who appear in the Pacific. This means California, Oregon, and Washington. They are constrained, they are constricted to living and working in the South for the most part. Some advance when you look at the East, North, Central, which is the Great Lakes, meaning Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, areas that Blacks have begun to migrate to. The Middle Atlantic is where we would find New York and areas of New Jersey and Philadelphia. 1950, it starts to spread out a little bit more. We get to see more Black teachers spreading out a little bit, but they are still, even by 1950, still highly concentrated. This concentration is the clue to you that Blacks are being confined. This is what teacher pay looked like by race and region and by educational attainment. If you look in the South here, we can see it more graphically. You see that whites, this with the blue line is some college, the red line is a bachelor's or more, that whites with some college are approximating the pay that Blacks had, even if they had a bachelor's degree when they were teaching. And you see that the pay in the South is much lower than in other regions. Again, another indication that this high concentration of Blacks in the South, if they could have moved, if they could have gotten a job outside the South, they would have greatly benefited. They weren't able to. And you see, overall, that's on the far right. This is what, Blacks as teachers were paid overall. You see how much heavily influenced it is by the South, nowhere near what the average is for, Blacks outside of the South, because, again, the bulk of them are living in the South. So you see this gap. Blacks overrepresented, highly segregated into teaching, paid much less than whites. This is state action. They are being paid by the state less than their counterparts. Now, Black people did not sit by. I'm going to include in this presentation lots of issues of Black agency. Black people didn't sit by. They figured out how to get education. They figured out how to fight against this. The first case, and this again to make it kind of personal, Aileen Black, who taught at Booker T. Washington High School in Norfolk, Virginia, was my mother's science teacher. Aileen Black volunteered to be the first test case brought by Thurgood Marshall and the team of lawyers from the NAACP. Most of these are Howard University Law School faculty members to fight for her equal pay. The response of the school board was, you entered into this agreement voluntarily. You knew you were going to get paid less. If you don't want the contract, fine, don't take it. They fired her. Subsequent to Aileen being fired, then another teacher at Booker T. Washington High School stepped up, Melvin Alston, and was the successful case that Thurgood Marshall brought to bring about equal pay for Black teachers in the South. And so when we skip to 1950, we see that the pay has become much more equal in the South as a result of litigation that started in the 1930s, hadn't taken full force in the 1940s, but by the 1950s, you see that Blacks with a bachelor's degree are paid much more than whites who only had teacher certificates, paid close to what whites were being paid, and that the overall pay for Black teachers, that's the yellow line there in the South, is much closer for Blacks and whites. Outside the South, you see great success for Blacks. They are now outpaid compared to whites who are in teaching. And overall, you see much more equality between Blacks and whites in terms of what are teachers being paid. That's because of Black agency and fighting against that discrimination. It does not erase the 50 years of history up to that point where there was unequal pay compounded into the savings that generated a wealth gap. And before we get too happy with the idea that, oh, wow, you know, we got equal pay for the teachers, so Blacks with college degrees were doing okay compared to whites, you can see from this graph, the blue shades are the pay for whites, the orange shades are the pay for Blacks. You see, teaching is not the high paid occupation for people with college degrees. It's being managers. Whites who are managers are paid the most among the people with college degrees, and professionals. These are occupations in which Blacks are underrepresented. Again, this sense of being denied access despite educational attainment. So that's important to keep in mind. This is an example of state action, confining Blacks to the South, relegating them only to teaching in segregated settings, and even within that setting, having discriminated against them. Blacks fight against that, fight for equal pay. Get it, but this does not equalize the playing field. It only removes one element of that barrier. State enforcement is important because that's a contribution of the state to this action. Think about why there weren't Black teachers in California in meaningful numbers before 1950. And before you say, well, they weren't there, I'll just remind you, one of the reasons I showed you the picture of my family, well, Emma migrated to California in the 1930s. Her brother, who was on the far left, came to California in the 1930s, a little later. Black people from Oklahoma in particular, after the Tulsa riots, were quick to move to California. Remember that Los Angeles was basically an oil town at the beginning of the 20th century. These were people from oil territory in Oklahoma. And before we get too happy and celebrating about all this equal pay stuff, again, personal, the arrow there is pointing to Lacey Spriggs. That's my uncle. He was the first Black principal in the Des Moines school system. This is 1966. And you will see, even though he is, at this point, he had a master's degree and was principal of a junior high school there in Des Moines, he's the lowest paid secondary principal in the city, despite his master's degree. And if you look below there, you will see elementary school principals who are paid more then he's being paid as a junior high principal. About 15 years later, the city standardized the pay for junior and senior high school principals, and this pay disparity disappeared. But it's important to note that even in 1966, this kind of disparity persisted even outside the South in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm going to talk now about the significance of Isaac James, distant great uncle of mine. In that picture, I told you that he was a fireman. This is the educational attainment of all railroad workers in 1940. You can see it's a job that is readily accessible even for men at that time because the bulk of the workers had an 8th grade education or less. This is a middle-class job which is benefiting from the technological progress of the era. The change from water power to electricity meant that factories didn't have to be located next to water. Railroads become vitally important. The industrialization means that we need to move lots of goods very quickly. Some not located near water, the railroads become vital. So this is a job which sort of men with typical educational attainment could make a good living. They were early on in the ability to unionize. You see the difference between blacks and whites in terms of educational attainment isn't really that great. The majority of blacks had 8th grade or less. You see that there are some blacks with college or more. There's a little red line, the college or more is on the far right, and you can see that there are blacks in the railroad industry with some college. I'm going to concentrate on these locomotive firemen because it's an occupation that black men were easy to get into because when they were steam engines, this was a dirty job. This was a filthy job. You're shoveling the coal that keeps the fire going. The steam engines of that era were crude. They could explode. If you didn't have the skill to maintain the steam pressure properly, this was very dangerous work. Plus, it was dirty and grimy. No one wanted it. That's how black men were able to have access to it. You can see that for black men, the pay, the $1,250 a year, was much higher than what black men were getting in other occupations in the railroad industry. For whites, it was about the same, not that much different than what whites outside of the locomotive firemen were getting, and that's again because whites could be engineers, blacks could not. And whites who were in some of the other occupations were still paid more than blacks. You see the average pay for blacks compared to whites. Whites in this industry paid almost twice as much, even though most of these workers have little more than an 8th grade education. In terms of the importance of the industry, you see the big growth in firemen that's taking place. It peaks near 1920 because in the early part of the 20th century, that is when the diesel engine gets introduced. And by the 1920s, the railroad industry is quickly transforming from steam-powered to diesel-powered engines, and the job of firemen totally switches. It goes from a job that nobody wants to a job that everybody wants because they don't actually need somebody to stoke the fire. This is now a clean job. Fireman really means that you're an apprentice to become an engineer. Totally different job. And you see black men receding in numbers, almost disappearing from this occupation after 1920. There's a tick up in the 1940s because the war effort, we had to use every engine we possibly could, and they didn't want all the oil going to engines. They used some of the coal for trains, and so there's a tick up in firemen that takes place during World War II. So that's the spike you see from 1940 to 1950. The black share of railroad firemen, just like with the teachers, highly concentrated in the South. By the peak of the demand for this job in the 1920s, blacks are over 25% of the firemen in the South. But you see, they quickly decline because as the new technology comes in, as the transformation of this job from fireman to apprentice to being an engineer takes place, black men are being chased out. they're able to hold on during the war effort, and that's why you see the slight rise outside the South for Blacks taking place in the 1940s. This was the help of the war effort. Now, here's the key. In 1940, you notice there are no Black men who are firemen under the age of 33. This is the locking Black men out of this occupation. The only people under 33 are white because they are apprentices to become engineers. The Black men who are left because you can't get rid of all the steam engines. You still have some left, but these Black men, oddly, within their labor contracts now have super seniority. And so the result is that within their union contracts, they should be the most favored as firemen. Now, again, this is the educational attainment of people who are firemen. Again, heavily less than 8th grade is the dominant educational attainment. None of the Black men here have much more than an 8th grade education. You don't see Black men with more than an 8th grade education in this occupation in 1940. If we do the typical thing that economists do, let's look at are these Black men being paid fairly, controlling for education and age, age being the experience. You see there's a positive return to age, which is experience. You're getting paid more for your experience. You actually don't get paid more for education. You get paid a lot less for being Black. This 32% gap is the similar gap that we're talking about today for Black workers. That gap is the same as then in 1940 for this vital occupation. Black men did not take this sitting down. Remember, they have an advantage because they have seniority in those positions as firemen, and they're supposed to get the most desired runs and get paid the most money. They didn't sit down. You see this suit brought by Charles Hamilton Houston, who was famous for getting the Howard Law School into being the fighter for civil rights, bringing this lawsuit on behalf of the Black firemen, suing their union for this discrimination and winning an award against the Brotherhood for damages sustained by the plaintiff for not being given his full bargaining position. Agency, agency, agency. We have to remember that it isn't that Black people accepted where they were, they fought constantly. And it's important to note that when you think about what is it that was done wrong, it's not that Black people didn't understand it, that they didn't try to find avenues around it, they fought back. Now, remember I said there were Blacks with college degrees. Where were they? Here they are. This is the education and race of railroad porters, the Pullman porters, the union represented by A. Philip Randolph. And as you can see, Black men with college degrees wanted that job because that was the job that was accessible to them. So it's important to note how the acts of discrimination created these hierarchies that created the gaps that we see in 1940 that then takes off and gets compounded because that structure compounds and compounds each year with that wage gap. What you're looking at right now is a film taken during World War I of the 325th Field Signal Battalion. This was close to 400 Black men who, as you see in this film here, were trained to repair telegraph lines, telephone lines, and something no one in the United States knew how to do, radio. At the dawn of World War I, the United States Army only owned 2 radios. Both of them had been made in Germany. No one in the United States knew how to fix or repair radios. These men were a rare group of men with special skills. They were organized and trained just like their white counterparts. Exact same training, exact same equipment, exact same skill. They go over to World War I to fight, as you just saw. They early on encounter combat. On September 27th, when they get there, Lieutenant Herbert, a Black man who was one of the battalion's lead Black officers, is out on reconnaissance. He gets ahead of his line. The group turns and walks straight into a German machine gun nest. They take out those two machine guns. Unfortunately, they lose Corporal Charles Boykin and later Sergeant Henry Moody, the first two casualties for the 325th. William G. Herbert from New York enlisted voluntarily in Washington, D.C. Why? Because he was a student at Howard University, where these men were trained in radio technology to prepare them with a skill that no one else had. You see him here after the war with his war record and his enlistment, and he's still active in New York with the state military. And then he continues with the reserve, the 369th Infantry. Notice here, though, his degree says he has a Doctor of Dentistry from Howard University. He became a dentist. This is important to note. This man who has this rare skill in radio, rare skill in a technology no one else in the United States had, he becomes a dentist. But you will notice in his obituary that he's at the same time a personnel service supervisor at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Why? Because he wanted to continue to use his skills in electricity, even though he was being denied the full ability to do that. Another incident takes place with the same troops. Rufus Atwood of the 1st Platoon is in the cellar of a switchboard. Private Edgar White was operating the switchboard. Private Clark, the buzzer phone. Several of the men are standing in the dugout cellar, and suddenly German shells hit their position, and the ceiling and the wall explode. Havoc occurs in the cellar where the switchboard is located. Lieutenant Walker, who is the Black officer there, arrives in time, gets everybody under control. Sergeant Atwood then, with the aid of two of the privates who are there, reconnect this switchboard, vital to communications while they're being attacked. They reconnect the switchboard while they are under attack with bombs falling around them, so deadly that it hits an ammunition dump, and that starts to explode. In the midst of all of this, these men are skilled enough to put their position back together and keep communications going. A little bit about Lieutenant Richard Walker. You see, when he enlisted, he was a student at Fisk University. His father was a railroad postal clerk, high-paying job, $1,400 a year for a Black man in 1901. It's a lot of money. His grandfather, Nelson Walker, well, he went to Fisk University because his grandfather, Nelson Walker, helped to found Fisk University. His father-in-law was the U.S. ambassador to Liberia. This is no average person. He goes on after the war. Please note here, he works for the Employment Service, and he helps to place workers out of the state of Massachusetts. During World War II, he's enlisted to help recruit skilled Black workers. This is Sergeant Rufus Ballard I spoke of. He won the Bronze Star for the incident I just described. He becomes Kentucky State University's 6th president, the longest serving president in Kentucky State history. But please note what he did. This skilled man in a technology no one knew. What happens to Adolphus Burrell? Well, he ends up being a tailor, a presser for a tailor. This man who knew how to do telephones. Edgar White ends up being a chauffeur in Chicago. He leaves his home state of Kentucky for the opportunity to be a chauffeur, even though he has this rare skill.
Dr. Spriggs.
That's back to 1940. I'm going to wrap up here. 1940, you see what is going on in the telephone industry. No Black person is hired who has high school, some college or more. None of those 400 men gets hired by the telephone company. None of those 400 men end up in radio. None of them. The industry ends up being segregated. This is what industry could do. So these barriers are barriers of state effort, barriers of collusion among workers with employers, and the outright exclusion by employers. That's what generates this gap. That's what generates the savings gap that then compounds to the current wealth gap. It's important to keep that in mind.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs, for that informative expert testimony. And we're looking forward to asking you questions. The next panelist that we have to speak is Dr. Jacqueline Jones. Dr. Jacqueline Jones, you may begin your expert testimony. Is Dr. Jacqueline Jones here at this moment? If not, we can move on.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good morning.
We can hear you.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before the task force today. My emphasis today is on the harmful discriminatory effects of government policies at all levels, local, state, and federal, combined with private employer strategies related to profit-making and workplace configurations. I'll be following on Dr. Spriggs' analysis. Governmental entities played a significant part in promoting and sustaining racist practices, especially before 1964. As a result, those entities bear a direct responsibility for persistent patterns of poverty and low levels of asset accumulation among Black families in California and throughout the nation. Even after the passage of major civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s, private companies such as banks and corporations have engaged in lending and hiring practices that help to solidify patterns of racial inequality. Residential segregation and the harmful effects of U.S. tax policies continue to have adverse effects on Black families. The history of Black women represents a key element in this larger story of public-private complicity in limiting the economic opportunities for all Black people. Many Black Californians today trace their lineage back to the U.S. South, where their forebears were enslaved. The institution of slavery was a massive government-sustained program of wage theft, affecting millions of people of African and indigenous descent. Enslaved women worked in the fields and in the kitchens and parlors of their white masters and mistresses, performing what was traditionally considered men's work, growing crops, as well as women's work. They labored under the constant threat of sexual assault from overseers and plantation owners. The rape of women was an instrument of terrorism, but it was also a means of growing the enslaved workforce, thereby enriching the owner. Between 1619 and 1808, approximately 10 million men, women, and children were forcibly removed from Africa to the Americas. The vast majority went to the Caribbean and South America. Indeed, only about 4 to 6% of the total were transported to what would become the United States. Yet by 1865, the nation's Black population amounted to over 4.4 million people, revealing a dramatic pattern of natural growth over the generations. That number suggests the ardent labors of skilled hands, domestic servants, and bearers of children. Marked by shocking levels of sadism and sexual license, the system of slavery amounted to a form of state-sponsored domestic terrorism. Yet this system found favor with white Northerners, many of whom after 1790 or so benefited directly from the cotton economy, as sea captains, merchants, textile machine operatives, and consumers of cloth. The United States Constitution does not mention the word slavery, but the 1787 document did protect private property, which included enslaved workers. In 1790, Congress stipulated that only free white men should be allowed to immigrate to the United States and eventually apply for citizenship. At the local level, towns and counties sponsored slave patrols, who were groups of white men charged with recovering fugitives and maintaining a racialized order on the countryside. In 1850, a robust Fugitive Slave Act passed by Congress served the explicit interests of Southern slaveholders. During the Civil War, many enslaved people liberated themselves by seeking refuge behind Union lines. Black women labored in refugee camps as servants for Union officers and as laundresses for Union troops. In many cases, neither they nor their menfolk hired as fatigue workers received the financial compensation they had been promised. About 180,000 Black men from both the North and the South served in the Union military, though until the last year of the war, Black soldiers were paid less than their white counterparts. This discriminatory pay scale had profound effects on the well-being of wives, children, and other dependents. For Southern Black soldiers, serving in the Union Army put their loved ones at home at risk for their lives. In the wake of the abolition of slavery, the U.S. government made no concerted effort to compensate the millions of freed people who had literally slaved their whole lives to enrich their owners and the country generally. Most Black men and women emerged from bondage with only the clothes on their backs. They had no cash, land, or credit, prerequisites for self-sufficiency in the rural South. Throughout the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th, the vast majority of Southern Black families remained landless, confined to the exploitative sharecropping system and living as peons, forced to remain on a plantation until they could discharge their debt as reckoned by the white landowner employer. As late as the 1930s and 40s, many Southern Black families were tilling the soil much as their enslaved forebears had generations before. Beginning in 1890, all of the former Confederate states passed laws or amended their constitutions to deprive Black men of the right to vote. Some states entered into contracts with private employers to supply Black convicts, men and women who had been arrested on flimsy pretexts and sentenced to labor on a chain gang or in a mine or a rice field. At this point, it's helpful to step back and consider larger national trends in the gender division of labor. The Civil War opened up new employment for women in the fields of school teaching, as Dr. Briggs has discussed, and nursing. Black women who followed these professions were confined to work in under-resourced segregated schools and hospitals. In the late 19th century, the clerical, retail, and manufacturing sectors offered employment opportunities for white women. They were hired as receptionists, department store clerks, and telephone operators, as well as machine operatives. Throughout the country, a higher percentage of Black married women worked than their white counterparts, and Black women stayed in the paid labor force longer than whites, indicators of the need among these women to be joint or sole breadwinners in families that could not subsist on the meager pay of Black men, who themselves remain limited to ill-paid menial jobs. Overall, these trends suggested that Black women would be excluded from so-called modern forms of work, using machines as typewriters, textile looms, or sewing machines, and those defined by a set number of hours each day. Large-scale migration out of the South did not take place until World War I, when for the first time, Northern and Midwestern defense industries beckoned with well-paying jobs. Black women were an integral part of this migration, contributing to the war effort as workers in factories and on railroads. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s brought Northern African Americans into the Democratic Party in great numbers, but in the South, federal aid and public works programs were controlled by local white politicians. These officials saw no need to assist the large number of Black families devastated and displaced by the collapsing cotton economy, arguing that if there was laundry to be done or cotton to be picked for white folks, state and federal government should not provide Blacks with jobs or relief of any kind. During the 1930s, for the first time in the nation's history, the federal government sought to mitigate the harsh effects of unfettered employer power when it came to wages, hours, and working conditions. Nevertheless, the signal achievements of this era, Social Security and minimum hour, maximum wage, and anti-child labor legislation explicitly denied these benefits to workers in the agricultural and domestic service sectors, and to anyone who held a seasonal or part-time job. These restrictions affected approximately 85% of all Black workers in the United States. And two, federal initiatives often mandated racial segregation. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, for example, a New Deal program, the Federal Housing Authority of 1934, required that new housing be segregated if building contractors were to qualify for government loans. California has always beckoned to all kinds of people. For a number of reasons, Black people did not take part in this pre-1941 migration in large numbers, at least, for several reasons. Many lacked the means to buy a train ticket. Even those who could afford a car knew that the cross-country journey was a perilous one, without predictable sources of fuel for the car or food for the body along the way. Most significantly, though, California employers already had an abundant supply of labor, and major manufacturers made it clear that they would not hire Black applicants, male or female. It was not until the nation was well into World War II that the state's employers felt an acute labor shortage. Even then, it took the combined pressure of the state's NAACP, National Urban League, and Congress of Racial Equality to open the factory gates to African Americans. Blacks in California were also part of a national movement, the Double V for Victory campaign to defeat fascism abroad and racism at home. The sudden availability of well-paying defense jobs for Black men in 1942 and for Black women not until 1943 or so led to 5 million Black people migrating out of the South and into the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. Seemingly overnight, the newcomers transformed whole regions of California, including the San Francisco Bay Area. The intense demand for labor was not sufficient to overcome generations-long practices that adversely affected Black women and men. At the beginning of the war, in response to pressure from Black activists, the federal government created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, an agency that monitored federal defense industry contracts to ensure job opportunities for Black workers. At the same time, a government job placement agency, the United States Employment Service, and its Women's Advisory Commission catered to the prejudices of white employers and their workers. Some Black women were hired as welders and riveters, factory jobs that paid well, allowing them to contribute directly to the war effort and bolstering their confidence as workers and citizens. Yet it remained difficult, if not impossible, for individual Black people to challenge generations-old all-white workplaces. As thousands of migrants streamed into the Bay Area, the housing shortage deepened, forcing many Black families into makeshift, ramshackle, cramped quarters. Like women in general, Black women had to scramble to find childcare as local, state, and federal governments persisted in their historic refusal to provide support services for mothers of young children. Even though many women were working full-time, some on the night shift on behalf of the war effort. The war temporarily broke down some long-standing barriers so that women could perform what was previously designated as women's work, welding, riveting, and carpentry, for example. Yet after the war, women were displaced from their factory jobs by returning soldiers. White women resumed work as retail clerks and clerical staff, while Black women remained limited to employment as household domestics, cafeteria workers, and hospital aides. By 1950, the FEPC had been disbanded, and once again, employers could freely advertise that no Negroes need apply. Black unemployment rates soared. Because Black families continued to face stubborn challenges stemming from job discrimination and housing segregation, Black women's labor continued to be essential to the well-being of their households. While white men took advantage of the GI Bill to go to college, many Black men found their chances for higher education foreclosed by the lack of accredited, that is, white, colleges that would admit them. Banks engaged in pernicious redlining practices, which denied mortgage loans to even middle-class Black workers if they were living in an overwhelmingly Black area. In 1950, almost 30% of Black men between the ages of 20 and 24 were jobless, and employment patterns continued to reflect a Jim Crow occupational hierarchy. Residential segregation in particular played a major role in thwarting the aspirations of Black women. in their roles as wives, mothers, and workers. Confined to impoverished neighborhoods, they often faced long commutes to work. Their inability to purchase a home meant that they would remain at the mercy of landlords who realized they housed a captive group of people who could not afford to move. In the suburbs, so-called neighborhood improvement associations put pressure on homeowners not to sell to people of color, a trend supported by real estate agents and city councils. All white towns enlisted local police in discouraging Black families from moving into their neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Authority and the Veterans Administration refused to grant loans to Black veterans who wanted to buy houses in white areas. City authorities segregated public housing, refusing to build enough units to accommodate the numbers of Black applicants. Federal policy favored suburban homeowners over urban renters by providing tax breaks for interest on mortgage payments, by creating an interstate highway system that frequently decimated Black communities, and by refusing to loan money to housing contractors who refused to segregate any new developments they built. The combined effects of these policies and practices among bankers, real estate agents, city officials, and builders meant that over the generations, Black families would lack the assets of their white counterparts who owned their own homes. In the post-war period, government jobs became the bedrock of many Black families. Black men and women worked as bus drivers, social workers, and teachers. Nevertheless, some public sectors, such as law enforcement and firefighting, resisted integrating their ranks, using formal examinations and other machinations as pretexts for discrimination. And some work sites, once integrated, showed hostility toward people of color, making life miserable for them. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 marked the end of the federal government's active attempts to apply discriminatory policies to housing and unemployment, and the beginning of federal enforcement of voting laws. With the crumbling of legislative mandates upholding racial segregation, and with affirmative efforts by colleges and employers to admit Black people in meaningful numbers for the first time, a segment of the Black population began to thrive, especially the well-educated. Yet the absence of legal barriers was not sufficient to open the way to a brighter future for many Black women. Indeed, a confluence of events in the 1960s and 70s conspired to keep large numbers in poverty and relegated to low-paying, disagreeable jobs. The Immigration Act of 1965 opened the country to groups who competed with Black people for unskilled jobs. By this time, certain industries had taken advantage of local tax incentives and moved to the suburbs, making it difficult for people who did not own cars to get to work. Other industries took their production facilities offshore or to Mexico in an attempt to avoid American unions and minimum wage and maximum hour law. The global economy hit Black workers hard in the sectors they were just beginning to enter, textile production, for example. Some white-collar jobs, such as bank teller, were reduced or eliminated with the increased use of computers and robotics. In addition, a tax revolt among suburban taxpayers began to register in municipal budgets as towns and cities began to cut back on public employment in the transportation, education, and social welfare sectors, adversely affecting Black people who represented a disproportionate number of workers in those jobs. People in distressed communities such as Watts and Compton lacked access to well-paying jobs that did not require a college education, and they lacked the resources to move into middle-class white suburbs. The available jobs were concentrated in the service industry: fast food workers, home health aides, childcare workers. Without a substantial tax base, the public schools in these areas were unable to provide an adequate education to prepare students for the challenges of the 21st century global workforce. Underground economies thrived, and police targeted Black men and youth for nonviolent offenses such as drug use, leading to high rates of incarceration and leaving wives and mothers to try to piece together a living on their own. Recent studies suggest the limitations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, as a force for a level playing field when it comes to employment opportunities. Some employers persist in discriminatory practices, now using a person's zip code as a proxy for their race. The rise of a service economy and the decline in manufacturing have limited the number of well-paying jobs for people with only a high school degree. In the early 2000s, banks switched from redlining communities of color to pushing predatory loans on them, leading to high rates of foreclosure, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. Perhaps most significantly for most middle-class Americans, equity in a home is a family's largest asset in terms of their total net worth. In 2016, the net worth of a typical white family was nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family, $171,000 versus $17,000. Generations of Black women as workers, wives, and mothers have paid a high price for these forms of discrimination, their talents squandered and their dreams dashed. In 2019, the Public Policy Institute of California reported that about 1/3, or 34% of the state's residents were poor or near poor, including more than 1/5 of all Latinas and 17.4% of African Americans, compared to 12% of whites. While 12% of white women were impoverished, the figure for Black women was 23%. In 2019, the median annual earnings of white women stood at $55,000, for Black women, $44,000. The discrepancy was even greater for men, $71,000 for white men, $48,000 for Black men. The COVID pandemic has had disastrous effects on Black communities. Some Black women lost their jobs as waitresses, fast food workers, and custodians, and others are overrepresented as frontline workers, serving as hospital orderlies and home health care workers, making more of them vulnerable to the virus. By way of conclusion, I do not mean to argue that Black Californians are the only group in the state who have endured systematic prejudice over the generations. However, the history of African Californians is unique because many of their forebears were enslaved in the American South. Government at all levels have initiated and enforced policies that limited Blacks' employment opportunities in direct and long-lasting ways. Indeed, federal agencies, local city officials, and school boards, law enforcement officers, together with state legislative and congressional inaction, have played a major role in limiting the ability of Black women to achieve material success and their highest potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that incredibly informative expert testimony. We're looking forward to engaging with you further on this topic. Now I'd like to introduce our next expert witness, Lawrence Lucas. And Mr. Lucas, you may begin your testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the presenters. But I'd like for you to play a piece that was very striking, that tells the depth and the breadth of Black farmers. Thank you.
It's my livelihood in farming. I couldn't farm. They took away the one thing that I really loved, and that was farming. That's what the USDA did.
He showed me a big tarp that had the words on it, "Nigger, go home."
The lack of commitment by too many people to not really caring whether we did justice or not.
Even as long as it's been, we've experienced discrimination for a very, very long time, and most people would have given up. To this date, I haven't given up, and I never will give up, until justice is served.
That's what my daddy would always say. He says I wasn't in trouble or anything. Everything was fine until I went up to defend my dad. And he says, what was I supposed to do? He says, I'm a man, and that's my daddy. I'm supposed to defend him.
He said, don't let USDA take my land. It was like anybody else, but just don't you let the land. And we've done that. Nobody else has taken it either. But for sure, the USDA will never get it.
Quite frankly, I say that the United States Department of Agriculture murdered
them.
My mother and father and my brother.
The number of acres lost by Black farmers are tremendous. Millions of acres we owned after slavery. And then we were reduced to this day to maybe 17 or 18,000 farmers and a small degree of land. What I want to say to you is that the present lawsuits that are brought against Black farmers by frivolous and racist individuals around the country will not stop our drive in the struggle for Black farmers. The income of Black farmers have drastically been reduced, and the amount of wealth that has been taken from Black farmers is tremendous, and it will be never again returned. What you would call reparations, we call it justice. What you have heard is only a part of why we do what we do, why you must do what you have to do in California to right the wrongs suffered by Black people. You call it reparations, we call it justice. Thank you, California Reparations Task Force, for inviting me here today and taking on, and we understand the daunting task that you have to right some of the wrongs for Black people in this country. I want to say that the Coalition of Minority Employees and the Justice for Black Farmer group is honored to be here today, sending out a call, which you are sending out a call to your citizens. Again, I say, we call it justice. You call it reparations. Thank you, Ms. Moore, who heard a conversation talking about a letter that we sent to the Secretary of Agriculture in June 2 of 2021. If not for her seeing that tape, we wouldn't be here today. That letter and the testimony we submitted speaks to the same racism, sexism, and retaliation and harassment that employees at the Department of Agriculture suffered, but also the pain and suffering of many farmers and employees. I'm sorry to say that things are not any better at USDA, and I'm sorry to say that it doesn't look like it's going to get any better under the times that we are faced. You have white farmers who own most of the land and get all the benefits from the land. They are the ones now bringing court cases around the country, saying that it's discriminatory to have debt relief for Black farmers. When I experienced in my youth racism and sexism, it brought me to where I am today. And I'm sure that many of you all on this panel that you have listened to your parents and you have experienced some of the same indignities that Black farmers have suffered. You call it reparations, we call it justice. The reason why I'm here today is because I stand on the backs of pain and suffering of farmers and many other people in this country. If not for Dr. Tolson leading me to a book and a poem written by Robert Frost, two roads diverge in a yellow wood, and I took the road less traveled by. I see what you all are doing in California is what needs to be done across this country. The courage of your governor and the courage of the people on this reparations committee to take on this daunting task and start by talking to other people about their pain and suffering. And thanks for including and getting an understanding of what Black farmers have suffered, what women have suffered. We look at all the abuses that's going on in the country as it relates to sexual abuse, and we ignore what is going on at USDA in this nation. And that is because we've been failed by our leadership. We've been failed by our Congress. But we have faith, just like you all will have to have the faith and the strength as you work through this reparation issue with your citizens in California. The injustice they have received from your state and county, you have every right to do something about it. If not now, why? If not now, when? There must be accountability. There must be transparency in order for a state and this nation to move forward with a sense of humanity and dignity. Once a nation that had a rating of 95 in the world in terms of democracy, it is now 83 in the rating in the world view. Melvin Van Peebles, actor, writer, producer, and more, wrote a play that I saw in my early years in New York. It was called Ain't Supposed to Die of Natural Death. It showed in its action a demonstration for rights and maybe even rioting. And then all of a sudden, money flowed down onto the stage, and the people went into slow motion. That is what's happening in this country. Our leaders and many of the people that are responsible for the pain and suffering of Black farmers are people that look like us, people that look like many of us. But we've come together as an organization, multiracial and multicultural, to stand up for the land loss, to stand up for the harassment, to stand up for the loss of wealth of Black farmers. we are sharing with you a culture of systemic racism at the U.S. Department of Agriculture that denies Black farmers their dignity, that denies Black farmers a right to farm, denies Black farmers the right to the same programs and services that white farmers get in this country. You call it reparations that's needed. We call it justice. The internal wheels of justice have been and still is slow in some of the cases that exist and the ones that you face. That share, we're going to share with you. And in the paper that we did was probably somewhat different than all the others. We don't have a lot of charts. We only talk about the pain and suffering. We talk about the lack of humanity, the lack of dignity and respect that goes on at the Department of Agriculture. We were told by Secretary Vilsaps, who is now Secretary, that what we were asking for Black farmers in our effort to fight for justice for them, that debt relief was unconstitutional. We see today that that self-fulfilling prophecy of Tom Vilsapp and his group with the filing of these frivolous and racist complaints around the country, yes, we see it as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those cases are frivolous that are brought against these farmers who are fighting for their dignity and respect in their land and their wealth. Black farmers and the lawsuits that are coming up in about a week or two in Tennessee will probably put, hopefully, a pin in what is going on in the lives of Black farmers. We thought that it was important that our group bring to the attention of the candidates running for president, both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, we confronted with the fact that she thought and was told that the reason why Black farmers are being discriminated against is because of heirs property. That's not true. People are lining up, by the way, with the money that's flowing out of Washington to benefit from the heirs property, while Black farmers still today suffer, cases not settled. I can't tell you the pain that I've felt with the number of Black farmers that I've seen die, ill. Farmers passed on because they couldn't get the justice, because they could not continue to farm. They could not have a way of life like white farmers. That is very painful. But we went to Elizabeth Warren when she thought it was heirs property, and she sat down with us and her staff, and we were able to convince her, like we are still trying to convince the government, some of our leaders today, that the real reason that we have discrimination at the U.S. Department of Agriculture is because of the systemic discrimination at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That discrimination goes to the heart and to the heartland, where Black farmers have to sit down and ask a racist county committee person or committee to give them the same benefits and services they give white farmers.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Let me say this. I want to close by saying thank you for the work that you have in front of you. And I want to remind you of what you saw when my presentation started. I thank you very much, but I'd like to use my last few seconds of putting on the tape that you saw in the beginning.
I lost my livelihood in farming. I couldn't farm. They took away the one thing that I really loved, and that was farming. That's what the USDA did.
He showed me a big tarp that had the words on it, nigger, go home.
The lack of commitment by too many people to not really caring whether we did justice or not.
Even as long as it's been, you know, we've experienced discrimination for a very, very long time, and most people would have given up. To this date, I haven't given up, and I never will give up, you know, until justice is served.
That's what my daddy would always say. He says I wasn't in trouble or anything. Everything was fine until I went up to defend my dad. And he says, what was I supposed to do? He says, I'm a man, and that's my daddy. I'm supposed to defend him.
He said, don't let USDA take my land. It was like anybody else, but just don't chew at the land. And we've done that. Nobody else has taken it either, but for sure the USDA will never get it.
Quite frankly, I say that the United States Department of Agriculture murdered
them.
My mother and father and my brother.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lucas, for that incredibly moving expert and personal testimony. We really appreciate it. Now we have Mirza Baradaran available. Welcome, Professor Baradaran. She is available from 11:35 to 12:05. So without further ado, she's scheduled to speak for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll reserve the balance for questions. Ms. Baradaran, you may begin when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry for the rush. We're on fall break, and I'm traveling today, so I apologize for that. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Just a little bit about myself. I am a law professor who writes about banking, credit policies, and otherwise. I have no personal history connected to the truths that I will reveal. I'm actually an immigrant to America, and so I'm coming from this from a research angle, and so I submit my testimony in that light. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, the Black community owned less than 1% of the United States total wealth. More than 150 years later, that number has barely budged. The gap between average white wealth and Black wealth has increased over the last decades. Today, across every socioeconomic level, Black families have a fraction of the wealth of white families. And this wealth chasm doesn't abate with income or with education. In other words, this is a wealth gap that is very much tied to a history of exclusion and exploitation, and not to be remedied by higher education or higher income. Without targeted policies to close this wealth chasm, it will continue to grow. And I want to be clear about how this racial wealth gap was created. It was created, maintained, and perpetuated through public policy at the federal, state, and local level. Laws, policies, contracts, and the lack of protection of Black communities' property by the law, the enforced segregation by the federal and state bureaucracies that created a race-based bifurcated economy, created this historic racial wealth gap that self-perpetuates today without any necessity for added inputs. Black men and women have been shut out of most avenues of middle-class wealth creation. Black homes, farms, and savings were not given the full protection of the law, even as these properties were subject to racial terrorism. In employment, education, housing, farm loans, even patent rights, racist policies and practices have either shut Black communities out of the market entirely or offered them separate and subpar services. And this is despite Black banks, Black businesses, and Black communities having engaged in 150 years, if not longer, under brutal and hostile legal conditions to try entrepreneurship and self-help and coordination. The American middle class, however, was not created that way. It was not created through self-help and pull yourself up by bootstrapism. It was created principally through government-supported credit infrastructure that didn't cross the red lines the policymakers drew around Black neighborhoods. You can look today across California, in Los Angeles area, in the Fresno area, in the San Diego area, and San Francisco, and look at the initial red line maps that were created for those areas. And it will say explicitly on those red line maps that this is a neighborhood, with Black people, with these subversive races. Sometimes they talk about racial, inharmonious racial mix. And those red lines were drawn around those communities. And for the next almost 80 years, no public subsidized credit, neither mortgage credit or consumer credit, would pass through those red lines. These very same red line communities were then targeted with the most toxic loans during the subprime crisis. And with the blow up of the subprime crisis, the Black community lost another 53% of its wealth. And this time, there were no federal guarantees. These communities have yet to recover from the blow when they were hit yet again with the devastation of the COVID crisis and the unequal distribution of the PPP loans. This is a system that can accurately be described, and I have written an article with this name, that it is a Jim Crow credit and capital system. It is separate and unequal. And many of these discriminatory policies of de jure exclusion have thankfully been explicitly abandoned. Yet the racial wealth gap remains because the damaging effects of these policies have never been directly remedied or counteracted. The wealth gap that those red lines put into motion continues and will continue unless it is disrupted by the same policymakers, namely the US Congress, state Congresses, and regulators that oversee these bureaucracies. In order, or public services, I should say, in order to achieve true racial equity, we must reckon with the fruits of our nation's history. In fact, I believe that it is the myths that we tell about our history and the economy that present the biggest hurdles to achieving economic justice. Myths that blame those who were the targets of discrimination for disparities they did not create, and myths that offer personal responsibility instead of justice. In my work, I've tried to debunk two of these myths in particular. One, the myth of self-help finance as an avenue to wealth creation. I call this the George Bailey myth of the famous movie. And two is the myth of personal decision-making, the bootstrap myth. There are no amount of individual spending and savings decisions, no amount of lattes, avocado toast, or sneakers foregone, as public policymakers would advise, and no amount of hours worked that can counteract the forceful headwinds of historic policies. People do work hard, and people do make hard financial decisions, and yet they still face the legacies of racist policies in segregated schools, neighborhoods, and access to mobility. No matter what the family structure, the wealth gap exists. Black and white families who do everything, quote unquote, the right way, as some people on the right would say, get married, get an education, buy a home, start a business, save their money, and still the wealth gap persists. In fact, this gap is highest at the very top of the income and education ladder. So this is not caused by any personal decisions or cultural decisions, as a lot of racist explanations have offered over the last 100 years. And just to be clear, investing, working hard, getting an education, starting a business are all great things to do. And my point is not that these things aren't worth doing, it is that they have been done for centuries. From investing hard-earned wages into the Freedmen's Bank, to marching for jobs, to taking out a mortgage, these prudent financial decisions were often taken amidst a history of exclusion, exploitation, violence, and virulent racism. And quite frankly, outright land theft in California specifically. Black institutions have been creative and innovative in serving their communities in a hostile climate. I've written a book about the long history of entrepreneurship, self-help, and mutual uplift. HBCUs have provided stellar educations. Black banks have lent to Black businesses, churches, and families. They have offered credit where the FHA refused to guarantee loans. And Black families have invested in these homes at great personal cost. Their homes are valued less because they are in Black neighborhoods. This racial gap in home values is just one example of the tangible present effects of a history of exclusion. And the racial wealth gap is where past injustice breeds present suffering. In order to move forward, we must make public policy that disrupt the patterns that sustain disparities in wealth. For it is obvious, stated Dr. Martin Luther King, that if a man is entering the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, he would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. The racial wealth gap was created by exclusionary policies coordinated across the branches of government. It was created systematically through taxation, banking, housing laws, private markets sustained by federal subsidies. And this is exactly the level of holistic coordination across governmental agencies, federal, state, and local, that is necessary to close the racial wealth gap. President Biden recently said that we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole government. And I, in written testimonies I've written and other books, I've suggested several steps that can be taken to aimed at various sectors of the economy. And these efforts should be coordinated, tracked, and measured across governmental agencies through a dedicated task force for the sole purpose of closing the racial wealth gap. Policies must provide a meaningful path to capital creation, access to low-cost credit, financial inclusion, tax justice, and home ownership grants. In other words, the same programs provided to white families over the last century. And I want to be clear about this. Nothing short of a full reparations can meet the scale of the harm done. And even then, the harms are not fully remedied. They will not be remedied with as much money as we can use to remedy just the monetary benefits, because what remains are the psychological, the trauma of being subjects of terrorism historically and having those properties removed. Real reforms, however, require that we look directly at this history. We must design a holistic remedy with a singular mission to achieve the promises of justice and equality in our nation's constitution that we promised each other. And I will conclude again with the words of President Biden, because this is the current administration, that it's time to act now, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we do, we'll all be better off for it. So I appreciate the testimony. I'm here for questions of any kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Baradaran, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to provide such informative expert testimony. We truly appreciate it. So we heard from 4 experts, and the breadth of what we heard is just magnanimous, right? And so at this time, we have about 15 minutes reserved for comments and questions from task force members. And so at this time, if a task force member would like to be recognized for a question or comment, please do so. Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the task force. And to our indescribable panel, you said it all. You stated the case. And all we need to do is to internalize the slogan of Nike, just do it. Langston Hughes said so eloquently, I swear to the Lord, I still can't see. Democracy means everybody but me. You all have stated the case of how this nation has masterminded the art of establishing exclusionary policies and practices that have denied sons and daughters of the darker hue economic justice, and all that we should have had has been taken away from us. Stennis and Eastland, both in Mississippi, came filthy rich through the soil bank program that I knew about in Mississippi when I was a child, back in the 50s and 60s. California, what was done to destroy Allensworth, that was established by a black preacher from Kentucky. We just need to pay up and not do a lot of talk up. And I trust that members of this panel will stay the course and continue to bring such expert, eloquent, erudite, excellent presenters. And we need to make sure that these testimonies are shouted from the housetop and throughout the length and breadth of this state of California. I end with this comment. It was Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays delivered his final charge to the graduate at Morehouse of the class of 1967. This man, who was the intellectual and spiritual mentor of Martin Luther King, said, and I quote him, "Our problem in the future will not come from the rabid segregationists like George Wallace of Alabama, Forwards of Arkansas, Lester Maddox of Georgia, or Ross Barnett of Mississippi. Our problem," said Dr. Mays, "will come from the so-called aggressive white liberals who will wine and dine you in the swankies of hotels, sip tea with you, but will refuse to share economic and political power with you. This task force has a responsibility of, in a strategic, smart, persistent way, delivering on what you have revealed to us about reparations and justice that is done and not just talked about. Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me this opportunity, but I'm just full of myself now. Lord had permitted me to see 80 years plus and to witness all the horrors of Mississippi and come to the point of half-stepping on the rightness and the significance of this call for reparations in our time.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Brown, for that comment. Member Grills, you are recognized. You're on mute, Member Grills.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to say thank you to the entire panel. Your testimony puts in stark relief the intersecting systems that must be addressed in any discussion of reparations. I want to address a quick question to Professor Jones. Your discussion of Black women invokes for me the Black family and further Black children. And I was wondering if you have any information on the issue of forced Black child labor immediately following emancipation. Things like the restrictive apprenticeship contracts where Black boys until they were 21 and Black girls until they were 18 were forced to stay first on the plantation that they were enslaved on. The former master got dibs. And it's a situation where Black parents, if they were there, were knowledgeable about this apprenticeship, petitioned the federal government to regain custody, but mostly to no avail. And this is not only an issue of intersecting systems, but the continuity of dynamics and patterns over time, because this is a fight we still see today in the child welfare system as Black parents fight for reunification with their children who are swept up into that child welfare process. Does your research include anything on that? When you start talking about Black women, you're talking about Black families and you're talking about Black children.
Yes, well, Dr. Grills, you've explained the so-called apprenticeship program in the South already. And yes, it was a way for plantation owners to appropriate the labor of children, essentially take them out of the care of their parents, exploit them in the fields. I will say even children who weren't apprenticed were expected to work in the cotton fields until well into the 20th century. Again, anti-child labor legislation of the 1930s did not apply to the agricultural sector. And these children were supposed to be picking cotton, helping adults in the fields. So there was this general appropriation of child labor for a century or more after the end of slavery.
That's really good to know. So that the child labor laws did not extend to agriculture.
Not through the 1930s. It was quite a bit after that. You know, many migrant laborers, agricultural workers, seasonal pickers were all excluded from the legislation, the social welfare legislation of the 1930s. And only gradually has that injustice been redressed for certain groups in the country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Grills. Would any other task force member like to be recognized at this moment? Member Holder, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. This is just a question addressed to anyone on the panel who would like to answer. Thank you for your testimony, very enlightening. You've all talked about the varying government programs as well as private industry policies and practices, but government programs specifically that created and embedded this wealth gap. I was wondering if you could speak to the issue, the Homestead Act specifically. Professor Baradaran talked about, you know, the importance of housing and developing equity through housing, how that is kind of the critical piece in terms of building wealth, generational wealth. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about the Homestead Act and how that allowed white families to create generational wealth and excluded African Americans from those opportunities.
I can take a stab at this a question. I mean, you know, depending on the historical moment, there were different ways that the federal government helped wealth creation, and you know, obviously, during the institution of slavery, during enslavement, it was capital, property in man, right? So the bodies of Black men and women were used as a means of wealth in the South, especially, but also in the North from the cotton that it produced. After that, from Reconstruction until about the 1930s, it was land, it was farming land, and that was given through the Homestead Act for free, or a few dollars to white families who moved west, and for a variety of reasons, Black families did not get them. It was not just exclusion, but also the hostility of the Southern sharecropping system that relied on Black labor, and that the really onerous sharecropping arrangement that W.E.B. Du Bois calls basically re-enslavement through debt. And so the Homestead Acts were not only not offered, but the debt economy sort of kept Black farmers trapped in those conditions. And so that was the era that kind of ended with the Industrial Revolution. And then post New Deal, it has been mortgage subsidies, and GI bills, and all of that sort of government subsidized credit through the secondary markets and other things. And so that is not to say that for now the primary driver is homes and land, but it is for the large majority of Americans. The top now 1%, there is large stores of capital in sort of abstractions like stocks and markets and bonds and sort of the global system of capital. But for the middle class, it really is a home, because a home is not just your equity, it is also the access you have to schooling, through home taxes, through transportation. Often because of the redlined areas and that history of exclusion, the most environmentally polluting sources are in those formerly redlined areas that are usually Black and brown communities. The degradation of the environment is paid, that cost is paid most by Black and brown families, especially in California. And those are all tied at this point to housing segregation.
Member Grills, did you have another question? Sorry, okay. Yes, this is for Professor Baradaran. You mentioned that nothing short of full reparations would begin to close the wealth gap. And I was wondering if you might itemize what full reparations mean.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm going to go to some legal principles here. I teach contracts law to UCI Law School to 1Ls every year, and I've been teaching 2 sections this year, so this is all fresh in memory. In contracts, we have a form of damages where and this happens in complex litigation. If you look at any massive scale problem like the 9/11 loss of life or opiates. The legal system measures damages to make one whole. So if there's a contract breach, you pay damages to make that person who you breached against whole. Now, what does whole mean? Well, it is the lost things that they didn't get because of that breach. And if we look at the breach, I mean, we can go all the way back to the 1619 arrival of the first ships of human beings in chains, or we can go to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were an explicit promise to Black communities for equal protection under the law, due process, and those were violated. That's breach. And so how do you make a community whole based on breach over and over again? And so you restore the lost wealth. And this is where you go to outcome-driven responses. So how do you close the racial wealth gap? Well, it was created across sectors. It was created by the Federal Reserve, by federal legislation, through credit policies, through the secondary market, through local school boards and zoning ordinances, and all of those mechanisms. So you bring those together to fix it. And one thing that could be done is, look, you have every agency has 5 years to in your agency close the racial wealth gap, and let them put the burden on the agencies that offer these subsidies. The Federal Reserve is a big one. Put the burden on them, and they can figure out how to do it, because that's where they know individually where the bodies lie, essentially. And the school boards, the same thing. I think you would say equalize the outcomes, and you would get there. But I do want to say that even with full-scale reparations, people are not made whole. And that's something that we must recognize is, looking at the Jewish people getting reparations from Germany. And I think you ask any person, were you made whole? Absolutely not. And same with the Japanese internment, victims. And so it's not to reach some sort of justice that is won't be achieved, but it is the least we can do, I think, as a moral duty.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I know, Marissa, you have like 3 minutes left until you have to jet off. Does anyone have another additional direct question for Professor Baradaran? So I have a question it's posed to any panelist really, but maybe to Professor Baradaran and Professor Spriggs. We have been talking about the task force subpoena power and our power to subpoena individuals, entities, agencies. And so I was wondering if you all had any insight in respect to your field of study, what entities we should look into. I have another question, but I'll just stop it there for now because it's separate and apart from the question I just posed.
Marcia, you're getting ready to go. Did you want to?
No, go ahead, William. I defer to you.
Well, I think there are a host of agencies that need to come full circle. We saw the recent reveal about land that had been taken from a family for animus there in California, and California has responded by restoring the property. But the same sort of deliberations that went on in the building of the highways in Los Angeles and the disruption to communities, those decision-making processes need to be looked at closely to understand why those neighborhoods, why those paths, this is very important for the Bay Area, for Black communities in the Bay Area, the displacement that took place. It's also important to look at these denials of opportunity. As I pointed out, the lack of Black teachers in the California system prior to the 1960s, the whole set of decision making to look at processes of recruitment, processes of making those kind of decisions. The point is to show agency, to show that this didn't just happen, that people were making conscious decisions of exclusion. And so that kind of document is helpful. It's helpful because, getting back to some comments others have made, when you have open mic, so to speak, with the community, it's to understand what has to be corrected, and that those are some of the places I think you want to begin to point to. The whole Hollywood industry needs to be accounted for. Silicon Valley, for its lack of Black programmers. Slides I didn't present, but Silicon Valley gets away with it. 25% of the computer programmers in Atlanta are Black. Almost 16% of the computer programmers here in the Washington, D.C. area are Black. This area in Washington maintains our national security, the NSA, the CIA. These are disproportionately Black programmers. And for Silicon Valley to be 5%, that is California sort of wink, wink, nod, nod. We're not going to pay attention to discrimination right here in our borders. And so I think you want to get at these actors and understand their thinking.
I'll add to Bill's testimony that that's really important to look at the what's been lost. And I would use like a simple, subpoena power. I would look at every city and locality on eminent domain. Looking at the Bruce Beach example, just every single decision. Bill said roads, but any sort of eminent domain, and whether there was a disproportionate effect on Black communities. One, and two, I would look at the contracts for each federal government contracting, and whether there was any sort of diversity in that. And third, I would look at zoning decisions and their effects. There are some avenues looking at disparate impact to kind of challenge zoning decisions that have clearly had a disparate impact. I mean, I'm calling here from Orange County, California, or that's where I live, and that the whole county, I would say, is in violation of zoning, toward racial inequity.
Thank you. So we've run out of time, but just for the record, I wanted to ask Professor Spriggs and Mr. Lucas, but another question. But for Professor Spriggs, I noticed in your presentation, you showed a man who was an expert in radio technology, and one of the tabs said that he was a native of Trinidad. I assume that's the island of Trinidad. And so I was curious, we had a conversation about the community of eligibility yesterday. We were talking about who should be eligible for reparations. And we talked about, should Black Americans do from chattel slavery? What about maybe some Black immigrants who, migrated to the United States not post-Reconstruction, pre-mass incarceration, kind of that area between, the early 1900s to 1965. What about that group, right? And so, I mean, it's just an objective question that I was just wanted to put out there. If you had any insight in your field of study, the idea, the field of data disaggregation is new. So, that type of data, tracking, who came from where wasn't necessarily the case, particularly in the 1900s. And then also, I'm sure a lot of, Black immigrants who did migrate here in the early 1900s probably integrated into Black American families, but I don't necessarily want to assume that. And so, I'm trying to tailor the question, but I just wanted to make note of that observation and figure out if you had any insight as to the community of eligibility in regards to those few, maybe, Black immigrants who were there in America and might have faced discrimination between that period. Does that make sense?
Yes, the question makes sense. It's, I think, important to note, again, where does some of the worst of the wealth gap come from? And there was some convergence which was happening up through 1900. It starts to stall, and it stalls tremendously when we get around the period of 1900 to 1920. Black farm owners, because they were starting with zero, relied heavily on credit to acquire land, and the acts of violence, intimidation, but the dramatic drop in farm prices in 1920 wiped them out because they were more leveraged than white farm owners. So you see us peak somewhere around 1918 in terms of land ownership, and then it collapses. And then there are complications dealing with Black banking during the 1920s as well. So a lot of the wealth gap is a set of actions that take place after 1920. A lot of it. So you have to make up in your mind, what do? Do you only treat the people who were here before, or do you talk about the massive amount of discrimination that took place during that period of ultra violence, of economic denial, do you compensate people for that too?
Thank you. So are there any last questions from the task force members to our esteemed panelists? Recognizing that we are over time. I just want to thank all of our panelists, Professor Spriggs, Professor Jacqueline Jones, Professor Baradaran, and of course, Mr. Lawrence Lucas. This is a 2-year effort, and this is the first of many conversations on these topics. And so we're looking forward to, continuing to further these conversations, and we hope to bring you all along this journey as well. So thank you again for your time. At this time, we will go to lunch, which will end at 1 p.m. So at this time, we'll go to lunch. Thank you.
Thank you for including us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Thank you, Professor Spriggs. And sorry we kind of cut short, Mr. Lucas. I know you were ready to get some questions going, but